Before we enter the tape, we have to mark the boundary around it. There is no documented case in the available record of a VHS cassette showing tomorrow's news. There is no verified archive entry, Federal Communications Commission report, station retrospective, court filing, museum catalog, or preservation guide confirming that a home recording displayed a viewer's name in a broadcast crawl before the event occurred. The title of this investigation belongs to fiction. The dread belongs to fiction. The impossible object at the center of it, a cassette that seems to remember forward, is not supported by any factual source. That distinction matters because analog horror often works by standing close to the documented world. It does not need to invent every wire in the wall. It borrows the wires that were already there. A VHS tape is already an archive object. It is a household thing that can carry a fragment of broadcast television away from the moment when it first appeared. A local newscast, a late movie, a weather interruption, a station identification, a commercial that no one meant to preserve, all of these could become trapped inside a plastic shell and discovered years later. That much is real. The home VCR made television less temporary. It allowed a living room to hold on to a signal after the station had moved on. The impossible version begins with a familiar action. Someone finds an old cassette. Someone inserts it into a machine that was built to play yesterday. The picture rolls, tears, stabilizes. A news desk appears. The anchor is calm. The graphics are ordinary. The date is wrong by 1 day. Then the lower crawl begins to move, not with a county warning or a traffic advisory, but with a name. Your name. Not a celebrity name. Not a coincidence that can be laughed away. Your full name, moving at the official pace of broadcast text. That is the nightmare. But the reason it feels plausible is not prophecy. It is infrastructure. Home videotape recording made private archives out of ordinary rooms. Broadcast emergency systems made urgent text feel official. Weather alert systems made coded geography part of public warning. Magnetic tape decay made damaged playback feel like evidence and corruption at the same time. And signal intrusion history proved that, under real conditions, a television broadcast could be interrupted by someone who was not supposed to be there. Each part exists. The prophecy does not. This report begins with that separation because the difference is the engine of the story. If we pretend the fictional tape is documented, the investigation becomes false. If we say only that it is fiction, we miss why the fiction has such a grip. The better question is not, did this happen? The better question is, what real systems make it feel as if it almost could? Start with the cassette itself. In the real world, VHS stands for Video Home System. It was developed by engineers at Victor Company of Japan Limited, also known as JVC. The format would become one of the defining household technologies of recorded television. But before that history unfolded, the idea was simple and profound. A viewer could capture a broadcast and play it later. Television, which had been scheduled and passing, could be delayed. A program could be removed from its appointed hour and replayed in a different one. That ordinary delay is the seed of the horror. A tape does not have to travel through time to disturb us. It only has to confuse our trust in when a recording belongs. A recording made last night should contain last night. A news bulletin taped on a Tuesday should not describe Wednesday with the confidence of a station that has already seen it. A crawl should not address the viewer personally. Yet the physical act of playing a cassette already produces a small temporal dislocation. You sit in the present and watch a broadcast that has ended. The announcer says now, but the now is gone. The clock on the screen may be hours, days, or decades away from the room where the tape is playing. VHS normalized that ghostly arrangement. It made it domestic. It put the problem on a shelf. The emergency crawl adds another layer. The emergency alert system is not a horror invention. It is a real public warning framework in the United States, governed by federal rules. Its protocol uses a structured message, preamble and header codes, an audio attention signal, the message itself, and then preamble plus end of message codes. Under federal rules, an EAS message may be audio, video, or text. For television, the visual message must contain specific information: the originator, the event, the location, and the valid time period of the alert. It may appear as a video crawl or as block text, and it must be readily readable and understandable. That kind of language is bureaucratic, but in horror, bureaucracy can be colder than screaming. A real alert does not plead with you. It identifies. It categorizes. It tells you where, what, and how long. It speaks in controlled fragments because clarity is the point. So when a fictional crawl carries a personal name, it becomes frightening not because crawls are strange, but because they are familiar. Viewers know the movement of emergency texts. They know the way it interrupts ordinary programming without asking permission. They know that it belongs to institutions, stations, agencies, and procedures. A crawl that says too much does not feel like a ghost whispering through the wall. It feels like the system has recognized you. NOAA Weather Radio SAME technology deepens that sense of targeted warning. SAME uses special digital codes that contain the event type, the geographic area, and the valid duration of an alert. NOAA states that SAME information can be heard as bursts of digital static before a 10-second 1050 Hz warning alarm tone and the voice message. Again, there is nothing prophetic in the documented mechanism. It is a way to route and define warnings. But for a story, the knowledge that real alerts can be encoded for particular places gives the fiction a concrete shape. The system does not have to know your soul. It only has to know your location. From there, imagination does the rest. Then there is the older fear of the interrupted signal. On November 22, 1987, television viewers in Chicago saw something that was not supposed to be on the air. WGN-TV's signal was hijacked during its 9 p.m. newscast, and the station was able to circumvent the intrusion after about 30 seconds. Later that same evening, WTTW was hijacked during a rerun of the Doctor Who serial Horror at Fang Rock. WTTW reported that the intrusion lasted about 90 seconds before the Doctor Who broadcast returned. The incident became known through the figure on screen, a person wearing a Max Headroom mask. WTTW later reported that the Federal Communications Commission investigated but did not determine who was responsible. This matters because it gives analog horror one of its strongest factual anchors. Not time travel. Not a cursed tape. Something simpler and more unsettling. A broadcast can be captured by an unauthorized image, and the identity behind it can remain unresolved. The fictional tape showing tomorrow's news borrows the emotional residue of that fact. It suggests that the channel was not merely recorded, but interfered with. It raises questions that sound technical before they sound supernatural. Was this a local broadcast? Was it an emergency simulation? Was the tape mislabeled? Was the playback distorted? Was the crawl part of the original signal or something impressed onto the recording later? The archive-report format thrives in that space, where the viewer is asked to separate mechanism from meaning. Magnetic tape itself helps preserve the uncertainty. National Archives guidance describes magnetic videotape as having a base layer, a binding layer, and sometimes a backcoat layer. Polyester is identified as the most likely base for videotape, though acetate and PVC may exist in earlier tape stocks. The same guidance gives magnetic tapes stored under archival conditions a broad lifespan of about 10 to 50 years before difficult-to-handle decay appears. That range is important for atmosphere because many home recordings from the late 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s now sit inside the period where playback problems are expected. A tape can stutter. An image can smear. The sound can wobble. A damaged recording can invite interpretation. A broken line of text may look like a message. A dropout may look like a cut. A tracking error may seem intentional because the human mind is built to search for pattern, especially when the room is dark and the machine is making a noise it has not made in years. But decay does not explain prophecy. It explains doubt. That is where this chapter holds the door open. The tape that should not exist is not a documented artifact. It is a fictional reconstruction built from real anxieties, the household archive, the delayed broadcast, the official crawl, the coded warning, the hijacked signal, and the failing medium. The fear comes from arranging verified parts around an impossible center. A machine made for yesterday should not show tomorrow. A public crawl meant for counties and events should not name one person. A cassette stored in a box should not behave like an active receiver. Yet every piece around that contradiction has a history, and the history begins not in a haunted basement, but in engineering rooms, factories, and a format whose name sounded almost too ordinary to become frightening: Video Home System. The name Video Home System sounds harmless because it was meant to. It does not promise prophecy. It does not suggest surveillance or possession or a private warning moving across the bottom of a screen. It describes a household machine, a system for the home, a way to bring recorded video out of broadcast facilities and into ordinary rooms. That plainness matters. The nightmare we are tracing depends on a contradiction, a device built to keep yesterday behaving as if it has access to tomorrow. To understand why that contradiction feels so wrong, we have to begin with what the machine was actually designed to do. VHS stands for Video Home System. It was developed by engineers at Victor Company of Japan Limited, better known as JVC. In the documented history of the format, two names appear with particular importance: Shizuo Takano and Yuma Shiraishi. They were not building an occult instrument. They were working inside a consumer electronics company on a format that would make video recording practical for households. The location matters too. The work was tied to JVC's Yokohama plant, an industrial setting rather than a legend's abandoned house. Yokohama gives the story a real geography: engineers, production lines, test equipment, casings, motors, heads, tape paths, and the slow translation of an idea into a machine that could be manufactured. The haunted version of VHS begins much later, after tapes are mislabeled, stored badly, inherited, forgotten, rewound, played again. But the format itself began in the language of design and production. This is one of the quiet tensions inside analog horror. The more ordinary the origin, the more disturbing the later behavior becomes. A cursed mirror is expected to misbehave. A black box from a ritual site arrives already accused. But a home video recorder has no such permission. It is made to sit beneath a television. It is made to accept a cassette, turn a spool, scan magnetic tape, and return a picture. Its horror is not in its intention. Its horror is in the possibility that a practical machine may have recorded more than anyone asked it to. On September 9, 1976, JVC announced the HR 3300 VHS home videotape recorder. That date is fixed in the format's documented history. The model number has become a kind of threshold marker: HR 3300, the first VHS videocassette recorder identified in accounts such as those of IEEE History and the Science Museum Group. It was manufactured in Japan in 1976, and it represented the arrival of VHS as a consumer format with a specific physical form. There is a useful discipline in staying with that fact. The HR 3300 did not appear as folklore. It was announced. It had a manufacturer. It belonged to an industrial schedule. It was not a tape found in a wall, already whispering through snow. It was a product introduced into the world under the assumptions of consumer electronics: reliability, usability, compatibility, sales. The first sale in Japan came on October 31st, 1976. The date is almost too tempting for a horror story, because in other contexts, October 31st carries a seasonal charge. But the archive does not need that coincidence to do more than it can support. The significance here is not supernatural timing. It is that by the end of October 1976, the video home system had crossed from announcement into purchase. A person could buy the machine. A household could own one. A broadcast, once temporary, could be captured. That is the first real unease. Before home recording, broadcast television was mostly an event in time. If the news aired at a certain hour, the viewer either saw it or missed it. A live or scheduled program passed through the room and vanished, except in memory or in institutional recordings beyond the viewer's control. VHS changed the relationship between the home and the signal. It gave the household a device for interrupting disappearance. This is why the phrase, "built for yesterday," is not only poetic, it is mechanically accurate. A VCR was meant to take something that had already been transmitted and make it available again. It allowed yesterday evening's program to re-enter the room this morning. It allowed a broadcast to be paused in the larger cultural sense, even if the original signal had moved on. It made time feel less final. In ordinary use, that power was convenient. In horror, convenience becomes the entry point. The cassette does not need to glow. It only needs to contain a familiar recording that is slightly wrong. The newscaster looks the same. The station graphics seem ordinary. The tape label says a date you understand. The machine whirs with the tired confidence of a domestic appliance. Then the crawl at the bottom of the screen says something it has no reason to know. But that impossible moment depends on the first possible one, the ability to record television at home at all. The HR 3300's importance is not just that it existed, but that it helped define a path from professional recording environments into private domestic space. The phrase video home system placed the home at the center of the technology. Not the studio, not the archive, not the broadcast station. The home. That word is comforting until it is not. A home is where a machine can sit unnoticed for years. A home is where a tape can be recorded casually, mislabeled, stacked with films, wedding footage, school events, late-night television, and storms captured by accident. A home is where the boundary between the public signal and private life becomes thin. The broadcast enters from outside, but once it is recorded, it belongs to the room. It can be replayed by one person, in the dark, long after the audience it was made for has disappeared. JVC's development of VHS at Yokohama was part of a broader history of consumer videotape systems. The format did not emerge into an empty world. Earlier systems had already pointed toward the possibility of recording video for domestic use. Philips VCR launched in 1972. Sony Betamax launched in 1975. VHS followed them, but it would become the name most strongly attached in memory to the home cassette era. That sequence is important because it keeps the story grounded. VHS was not the first attempt to bring video recording to consumers. It was part of a competition among formats, companies, and technical choices. Yet in cultural memory, VHS became almost synonymous with home video itself. The black cassette, the plastic shell, the hinged flap, the handwritten label, the rectangular machine under the television, these became the visual vocabulary of remembered media. When analog horror reaches for VHS, it is reaching for that vocabulary. It does not have to explain what a tape is doing in a closet. It does not have to justify why a family might have recorded television. The format became ordinary enough that its presence requires no special explanation. That ordinariness is what makes a fictional, corrupted tape feel discoverable rather than invented. Still, the documented origin remains precise. Victor Company of Japan Limited. JVC. Yokohama Plant. Shizuo Takano. Yuma Shiraishi. HR 3300. September 9th, 1976. October 31st, 1976. Japan first, then later the United States and the United Kingdom in 1977. These are not atmospheric details added for texture. They are the frame that keeps the nightmare honest. If we are going to imagine a cassette that shows tomorrow's news, we have to understand the real machine as a machine of yesterday. Its task was preservation, not prediction. Its promise was access, not warning. It was made to answer a simple domestic desire. What if I could watch this later? That question seems innocent. But later is where the trouble begins. Later means the broadcast is no longer tied to its original moment. Later means context can change around an unchanged recording. A joke can become ominous. A weather report can become evidence. A local news crawl can be read with knowledge the original viewer did not have. A tape can sit for decades and then return, not as entertainment, but as a document from a room that no longer exists. And when a machine is built to bring the past forward, the viewer begins to depend on the direction of time. The tape must be behind us. The recording must be finished. The people on screen must not know who is watching now. The crawl must address a public audience, not a single name in the room. That is why the fictional violation lands so quietly. It does not require the whole machine to become impossible. It only requires one part of its purpose to turn around. The home recorder, designed to hold what has already happened, appears to deliver what has not yet occurred. The archive stops being passive. The old cassette stops behaving like storage and begins behaving like notice. In the factory history, there is no prophecy. There is only engineering. A consumer videotape format developed by JVC, announced in 1976, first sold in Japan that same year, and then carried outward into other markets. But those facts are enough to open the door to the next stage of the fear. Once the machine leaves Yokohama, once it moves from product announcement to living room furniture, it changes the room around it. The television is no longer only a receiver. The household is no longer only an audience. With a VCR beneath the set, the living room becomes a small archive, and every ordinary recording becomes a question waiting for playback. Once the recorder left the engineering story and entered the household, the meaning of television changed quietly. The set in the living room had once behaved like a window with fixed hours. The station transmitted, the viewer watched, and then the moment was gone. A news anchor's pause, a storm warning, a station identification, a line of text at the bottom of the screen, all of it passed through the room and disappeared into air. The home videocassette recorder altered that disappearance. VHS did not arrive in an empty field. The consumer dream of recording television at home had already been taking shape through earlier systems. Philips VCR appeared in 1972. Sony Betamax followed in 1975. VHS came after them, not as the first idea that television might be captured by a household machine, but as part of a wider movement that made recording seem less like a broadcast industry function and more like a domestic habit. By the time JVC's video home system began moving beyond its first sale in Japan and into markets such as the United States and the United Kingdom in 1977, the living room was becoming a place where broadcast time could be interrupted by private time. That is the important shift for this story. The machine did not need to predict anything to become unsettling. It only needed to keep something. A broadcast is meant to be public and temporary. A tape makes it private and repeatable. The same image that millions of people might have seen once could now be stored inside a cassette, carried to a shelf, labeled by hand, and played again at a later hour. A local newscast could be detached from the evening when it aired. A weather bulletin could be watched after the storm had passed. A program could be paused in the mind, even if the machine itself was only playing forward. The household had acquired a way to hold yesterday in a plastic case. In an archive, that sounds ordinary. In a living room, it changes the emotional rules. An archive is supposed to preserve. It is supposed to create distance between the event and the viewer. When we consult an archive, we expect the material to be over. The document may disturb us, but it should not be active. It should not be waiting for the person who opens the box. It should not know who is watching. The home VCR blurred that boundary because it made archival behavior casual. The viewer did not need a museum, a broadcaster, or a government collection. The viewer needed a television set, a recorder, and a cassette. The record was not sealed behind institutional procedures. It sat beside the family room carpet, under a lamp, in a cabinet with other objects that had no claim to history. A tape could be a movie, a children's program, a game show, a newscast, or a half-remembered accident of recording. It could contain exactly what the label said, or it could begin with something left over from a previous use. The uncertainty was domestic, not ceremonial. That uncertainty is where analog horror finds its first foothold. A familiar tape carries an expectation. If the label says Friday News, the viewer expects Friday News. If it was recorded during dinner, the viewer expects the anchor, the commercial break, the weather segment, perhaps the final minutes of the preceding program. The machine is supposed to obey the past. Its job is not interpretation. It is not revelation. It turns magnetic information into image and sound, and it does so with the plain mechanical patience of a household appliance. But Because the VCR lets the viewer return to the same recording, it also lets the viewer notice differences or believe differences have appeared. The scene can be watched once, then again. A crawl that seemed normal the first time can be paused in memory. A face in a crowd can become a question. A tone beneath the audio can seem intentional. A moment that would have vanished in live broadcast becomes available for suspicion. The terror is not only that something strange appears on the tape, it is that the tape can be checked. Live television forgives uncertainty because it moves away from us. If a viewer thinks they saw a strange line of text on a live broadcast, the room provides no evidence once the moment passes. But recorded television produces a second encounter. The viewer can rewind. The viewer can replay. The viewer can call someone else into the room and say, "Watch this part." That action feels rational. It feels investigative. It also deepens the trap. If the strange thing is still there, the tape becomes evidence. If it is not there, the viewer becomes the unstable object. This is why the haunted VHS premise feels different from a ghost story built around an old photograph or a diary. A videocassette is not merely an object from the past. It is a past event that can perform again. It has timing. It has sound. It has the authority of broadcast style if the original material came from television. It can reproduce a news desk, a station graphic, a warning banner, a lower third, a crawl. It can make the domestic screen behave as though the station has returned, even when the broadcast is long over. The viewer knows, at some level, that this should be impossible. A tape is not a receiver once it is being played back. It is not tuning to the present. It is not listening to the household. It is reading what was placed on it earlier. And yet the home VCR was built into the same furniture arrangement as live television. The same screen showed both the current broadcast and the stored recording. The same speakers carried both. The same remote control or front panel buttons made the shift feel almost seamless. One moment, the television could be a window onto the present. The next, it could be a device for summoning a captured evening. In that arrangement, a mistaken identity becomes easy to fear. Is this live or recorded? Is this the old tape or the station? Is the crawl part of the original broadcast or something the machine is adding? The rational answer is simple. The VCR plays stored material. But horror does not begin by defeating the rational answer. It begins by making the rational answer feel insufficient while leaving it intact. The earlier formats matter here because they show that VHS was part of a broader domestic transformation, not a single invention arriving from nowhere. Philips VCR in 1972 and Sony Betamax in 1975 had already introduced the idea that the household could possess a copy of television time. VHS followed and helped carry that idea deeper into ordinary use. The crucial horror ingredient is not that one format was magical, or cursed, or uniquely capable of impossible messages. The crucial ingredient is that the culture around television learned to accept the home recording as normal. Once that happens, a strange tape no longer needs an elaborate explanation for its existence. It can be found in a box. It can be inherited with other cassettes. It can be labeled in faded marker. It can be remembered incorrectly. It can be placed into the machine almost absent-mindedly. The setup becomes plausible because millions of ordinary recordings once had ordinary reasons to exist. An archive created by a household is also an archive with weak cataloging. Institutional archives try to preserve context, dates, sources, formats, condition notes, provenance. A domestic tape often preserves only fragments of that information, if any. The label may be vague. The recording may begin late. The ending may cut off. The cassette may contain more than one program. It may have been reused. It may carry a broadcast whose station, date, and location are not immediately clear to the person watching years later. This does not require invention. It follows from the simple fact that the home recorder placed archival power in private hands without giving the household the discipline of an archive. That disorder is frightening because broadcast material depends on context. A news crawl without context is only a strip of urgency. A warning without a date becomes unstable. A local report without a known location can feel both specific and homeless. When a tape says that something happened, the viewer must ask when. When a crawl says that something is happening, the viewer must ask whether the message belonged to the original broadcast or to the present act of playback. The tape does not answer. It only continues. In the fictional case at the center of this episode, the impossible moment is the appearance of tomorrow's news, and then the viewer's name in the crawl. No factual source verifies such an event, but the room in which it happens is historically real. The machine beneath the television is real. The habit of recording broadcasts is real. The uneasy authority of replay is real. VHS made it possible for a private person to trap the public signal and bring it back, not as memory, but as performance. That is why the living room becomes an archive, and why the archive feels alive. The television had once told the household what was happening now. The VCR taught the household to keep what had happened before. Between those two functions, a narrow space opened. In that space, a recorded newscast could be watched as if it were evidence, and a familiar tape could be accused of changing. The machine's purpose remained simple: record, store, replay. But the cultural meaning of those actions became large enough to reach the courts, because capturing a broadcast at home was no longer a strange, private experiment. It had become common enough, contested enough, and ordinary enough to require a legal name. That name was time shifting. Time shifting sounds almost gentle, as if the hours were furniture and the household had simply moved them across the room. It does not sound like a legal doctrine that could help make an analog nightmare feel believable. It does not sound like the name of a door opening. But for the haunted tape at the center of this story, that word matters because it gave an ordinary description to an uncanny act, taking a broadcast meant for one moment and making it appear in another. A television signal arrives as a present tense thing. It says, "Here is the news, here is the weather, here is the program, here is the warning." Before home recording became normal, that present tense had power. If a viewer missed the broadcast was gone. The household could remember it, argue about it, quote it imperfectly, but it could not summon the same image back onto the glass. The VCR changed that. It gave the household a way to detach television from its scheduled hour. A program sent at night could be watched in the morning. A news segment could be paused, rewound, and watched again. A crawl that had passed too quickly could be studied. The machine did not merely preserve entertainment. It preserved timing. It took something public, scheduled, and temporary and converted it into a private object. That conversion became important enough to reach the Supreme Court of the United States. The case was Sony Corp. of America v. Universal City Studios, Inc., reported as 464 U.S. 417, and decided in 1984. It is often remembered through the machine at the center of the dispute, Sony Betamax, but the legal significance reached beyond one format. The question concerned home videotaping of television broadcasts, especially non-commercial recording by private viewers so they could watch a program at a later time. The term for that was time shifting. That word gives the act a clean, practical shape. A person is not stealing time. A person is not interrupting the station. A person is not building a secret archive for some sinister purpose. A person is simply shifting the time of viewing. The program was broadcast. The viewer was not available or wanted to watch later, and the recorder made that later viewing possible. According to the U.S. Copyright Office Summary, the Supreme Court ruled that non-commercial home recording of television broadcasts for time shifting was fair use. For our purposes, the phrase is more than a legal conclusion. It is a cultural marker. It tells us that home recording was not an isolated curiosity. It was common and consequential enough to produce a major copyright dispute, and ordinary enough that the court recognized the non-commercial household practice of recording broadcasts to view later. That ordinariness is where the horror settles. If the premise were that a secret military device recorded tomorrow's news, the fear would belong to conspiracy. If the premise were that a laboratory machine captured future broadcasts, the fear would belong to science fiction. But a VHS cassette on a shelf, labeled in handwriting, placed beside other tapes of movies, sitcoms, school concerts, and local newscasts belongs to domestic life. It belongs to the exact zone that time shifting made normal. The haunted tape becomes frightening because it does not arrive as an alien object. It arrives disguised as a legal and familiar one. There is a particular kind of trust built into a home recording. The viewer may distrust the station, the anchor, the advertisement, or the official statement. But the tape itself feels like evidence of what was received. It seems passive. It seems incapable of intention. The cassette did not write the news, it only held it. The VCR did not choose the crawl, it only captured the signal. The household did not create the broadcast, it only recorded what came through the air or cable at the appointed hour. This is why a fictional tape showing tomorrow's news has such a strong hold. It violates the premise of time shifting by only a small amount at first. It does not ask the viewer to believe in a glowing portal or a prophetic voice. It asks the viewer to accept a familiar ritual. Someone set the recorder, left the room, and came back later. The tape is inserted. The tracking wavers. The broadcast begins. The date appears to be wrong. The terror is not that the machine is unknown. The terror is that the machine is behaving almost correctly. Sony Corp. of America v. Universal City Studios, Inc. helps explain that almost. The case addressed the practice of recording television at home for later viewing, and the recognition of that practice made the act socially legible. After time shifting, a recorded broadcast in a private living room did not need a special explanation. It could be a missed episode. It could be last night's movie. It could be a local news segment saved because a family member appeared for a few seconds in the background. It could be evidence of a storm warning, a public announcement, or a strange interruption. The legal ghost in this chapter is not a spirit in the tape. It is the lingering permission that makes the tape believable. It is the way a Supreme Court case helps populate the shelves of the nightmare. Once non-commercial home recording for time shifting is recognized as fair use, the fictional archive becomes larger. Any household could have tapes. Any tape could have been made for innocent reasons. Any recording could be mislabeled, forgotten, inherited, or replayed years after the original broadcast had lost its context. That is the foundation the story needs. A haunted VHS tape does not have to explain why someone was recording. Time shifting explains it. A tape containing a newscast does not have to be rare. Time shifting makes it routine. A viewer watching a broadcast outside its original hour does not have to be suspicious. Time shifting makes delayed viewing the point. The impossibility enters later, when the delayed broadcast appears to have delayed itself in the wrong direction. The phrase, tomorrow's news, is disturbing because news is supposed to belong to the day it reports. It may be repeated later, archived later, corrected later, but its authority depends on sequence. First the event, then the report. First the emergency, then the warning. First the death, then the crawl. A tape that reverses that order does not merely predict. It breaks the ordinary contract between broadcast time and household time. Yet it breaks that contract inside a practice the culture already accepted. That is the subtle power of the legal history. The court did not declare that tapes could be trusted. It did not address prophecy, apparitions, personalized crawls, or impossible dates. It addressed home videotaping for non-commercial time shifting. But in doing so, it confirmed the normality of the behavior on which the fictional terror depends. The viewer can sit in the dark and say, "This is just a recording." The law, the marketplace, and the design of the machine have all trained the viewer to believe that sentence. Then the crawl begins to move. In the imaginary tape, the first wrong detail might be explainable. A station error. A mislabeled cassette. A rebroadcast. A clock set incorrectly on the VCR. The viewer reaches for ordinary explanations because the object itself belongs to ordinary life. That instinct matters. Analog horror often works by delaying the moment when the viewer admits that the evidence no longer fits the category. The tape is familiar for as long as possible. The living room remains a living room. The television remains a television egg. The recording remains a recording. Only the time is wrong. And when the viewer's name appears in the crawl, the violation becomes intimate. Time shifting allowed private people to record public broadcasts. The fictional nightmare imagines the public broadcast answering back. It takes the legal and domestic act of recording television and turns it into a one-way mirror with the direction reversed. The household thought it had captured the signal. The signal seems to have identified the household. No source in the record verifies such an event. That boundary must stay clear. Sony Corp. of America v. Universal City Studios, Inc. does not support claims about predictive tapes, personalized warnings, or supernatural broadcasts. What it does support is the realism of the setup, people recording television at home, saving broadcasts for later, and treating delayed playback as a normal part of media life. The horror needs that realism. Without it, the tape is just a magic object. With it, the tape becomes an object from a recognizable shelf, governed by recognizable habits, handled by a person who has no reason to be afraid until the recording stops behaving like a record of the past. Time shifting gave viewers control over schedule. It let the household pull a broadcast out of the stream and hold it. But control over schedule is not the same as control over meaning. A tape can be played later, but the viewer cannot always recover the certainty of what it meant when it was made. Labels fade. Context disappears. Broadcast fragments survive without explanation. A crawl preserved at the bottom of the screen may outlive the event that produced it. The machine can return the image, but it cannot guarantee comfort. That is where the legal ghost remains useful to the nightmare. It stands behind the ordinary act and says, yes, people did this. Yes, home recordings existed for this reason. Yes, a private cassette of a television broadcast is a plausible artifact. The ghost is not proof of the impossible. It is permission for the possible details around it. A tape from yesterday can sit in a closet for years. It can be found after the person who recorded it has forgotten why. It can be played on a machine that struggles to hold the image steady. It can carry a broadcast that was once temporary and make it present again in a room that no longer matches the room where it was recorded. The law gives us time shifting as a household practice. The cassette gives that practice a body. And the body of the tape is not abstract. It is layered, chemical, aging, and vulnerable. If the recording is going to be treated as evidence, then the material carrying the evidence matters. Before the crawl can be judged, before the warning can be trusted or dismissed, the archive has to ask a quieter question. What exactly does magnetic tape remember? The question sounds almost too simple for the story around it. What does magnetic tape remember? Not what does it predict, not what does it want, not how does it know a name that should not be there. Before any of that, the archive has to begin with the object itself. A VHS cassette can feel sealed as if the black plastic shell is the thing that contains the past. You hold it by the edges. You read the label. You hear the faint movement of the reels inside. The cassette seems like a box with memory in it. But the recorded evidence is not really in the box. It is on the long, thin strip wound inside, and that strip is not a single substance. It is a layered material, engineered to move, flex, hold a signal, survive handling, and pass through a machine at the correct angle and speed. The National Archives describes magnetic videotape in terms of layers. There is a base layer. There is a binding layer. Sometimes there is also a backcoat layer. Those words are plain, almost industrial, but they are the beginning of the unease. A videotape is not a window. It is not a photograph. It is not a frozen broadcast. It is a physical compromise made of materials that have to stay together long enough for a machine to read them. The base layer is the support. It is the foundation on which the recording surface depends. For videotape, National Archives guidance identifies polyester as the most likely base. Earlier tape stocks may include acetate or PVC, but for the kind of videotape most people imagine when they picture an old household cassette, polyester is the likely material beneath the image. That fact matters because it keeps the horror from becoming magic too quickly. The tape does not need to be alive to be vulnerable. It does not need to be cursed to change the way a room feels when the picture breaks. Its material structure already carries a quiet threat. A recording that looks complete from the outside depends on a thin support that has aged in silence, maybe in a closet, maybe in a box under stairs, maybe beside a television that was thrown away years before the tape was found. On top of that base is the binding layer. The name gives away its role. The binder holds the magnetic particles that carry the recorded information. It is the layer that allows the signal to be stored as a magnetic pattern and later recovered by the playback equipment. In an archive report, this is where the story becomes less like memory and more like contact. The tape must touch the machine correctly. The magnetic layer must still be present, still coherent enough, still capable of giving up what was placed there. That is a colder idea than a haunted object whispering in the dark. The news crawl, the anchor's face, the station break, the weather bulletin, the ordinary commercial before the thing that should not have been recorded, all of it depends on a layer of material thin enough to pass through a consumer machine. The past is not locked away behind glass. It is riding on a surface. It can shed. It can fail. It can be misread. Sometimes, the National Archives notes, magnetic videotape also includes a back coat layer. Not every tape has one, but the possibility is important because it reminds us that videotape was designed as a moving object, not merely a storage object. It had to wind evenly. It had to reduce friction and static. It had to behave inside the cassette shell and inside the transport path of the recorder. The back of the tape mattered because the whole object was expected to move through pressure, tension, and repeated use. That movement is part of why the VHS cassette belongs so naturally to analog horror. A book can be opened to a page. A photograph can be held still. But a videotape must perform. It must be drawn out of itself. The machine has to pull the strip from the cassette, guide it, read it, and return it. The recording is not simply viewed. It is handled by the VCR every time it appears. So when someone in the story finds a cassette labeled with an old date, the first archival question is not whether the label is true. It is whether the materials inside can still survive playback. A tape may look unchanged while its layers have aged beyond easy handling. The National Archives gives a broad estimate for magnetic tapes stored under archival conditions, generally about 10 to 50 years before difficult-to-handle decay appears. That range is not a countdown clock. It is not a prophecy. It does not mean every tape fails at the same moment, or that a cassette becomes unreadable on its 50th birthday. It means that even under archival storage conditions, magnetic tape has a limited life as a stable, easily handled carrier. The range is wide because actual survival depends on many conditions, and the guidance does not require us to invent exotic causes. Time is enough. Materials are enough. The archive does not need thunder in the walls. This is where the fiction gains its real atmosphere. A VHS tape from the late 1970s, 1980s, or 1990s now sits inside that broad zone of concern. Many such recordings are old enough that playback problems are not surprising. The tape can be historically ordinary and still be physically uncertain. It can be just old enough for the evidence to feel compromised before anything impossible happens. That uncertainty is important to the premise. The claim is not that National Archives guidance supports a tape showing tomorrow's news. It does not. No source in this record verifies a cassette that predicted events, altered its content, or placed a viewer's name into a crawl. The documented facts are narrower and more useful. Videotape is layered. Polyester is the likely base for much videotape. Magnetic tapes have a limited lifespan, even when stored carefully. Over time, they can become difficult to handle. Those facts give the impossible event a believable container. They tell us what kind of body the nightmare would have to occupy. If the tape says something it should not say, the first witness is not a spirit, but a material object with a base, a binder, and perhaps a back coat. The first suspect is not tomorrow. It is age. It is the condition of the cassette. It is the machine's attempt to read a fragile strip that may no longer be as stable as it looks. There is a particular dread in that order of explanation. The archive does not rush to the supernatural. It asks whether the carrier is intact. It asks what the tape is made of. It asks whether the apparent message could be an artifact of decay, handling, or playback. The result is not reassurance. It is a slower kind of fear. If the tape is damaged, then the evidence cannot be trusted. If the tape is not damaged, then the evidence becomes harder to dismiss. Imagine the cassette on the table after playback has stopped. The screen is dark. The machine has released its hold. The tape has returned to being a plastic rectangle with a handwritten label. Nothing about it proves that a warning came from the future. Nothing about it proves that the crawl names the person watching. But the object has now been introduced as evidence, and evidence has a body. The body is layered. The layers are aging. The memory is not a metaphor floating outside matter. It is bonded to a surface that can deteriorate. That is what magnetic tape remembers first, not the future, but contact. The pressure of storage. The path through the recorder. The long years between recording and replay. The fragile agreement between base and binder, between signal and machine, between yesterday's broadcast and tonight's room. And once that agreement begins to fail, every flaw becomes available for interpretation. A tear in the image can look like interruption. A lost signal can feel like concealment. A damaged line of text can become a message the viewer completes in their own mind. The tape may be warning. It may be malfunctioning. It may be doing both only because the person watching can no longer tell the difference. The failure begins quietly, almost politely. Not with a scream from the television, not with a face appearing where the anchor should be, but with a small loss of confidence. The picture leans. The color weakens. A strip of snow crosses the screen and then disappears before anyone can decide whether it covered something important. The tape continues to move, and because it continues, the viewer keeps watching. That is one of the strongest materials analog horror has, not the impossible image, but the uncertain one. A clean recording can be argued with. A damaged recording asks for help. It invites the viewer to complete it, to restore it mentally, to decide what was probably there before the defect arrived. And that decision can become dangerous when the tape has already been introduced as evidence. If the cassette is supposed to contain last night's newscast, and the newscast appears to contain tomorrow's headline, every physical flaw becomes part of the investigation. The question is no longer only what the tape shows. The question is what the tape can still show. The National Archives guidance gives the archive a sober starting point. Magnetic videotape is not an eternal container. It is a manufactured object made of layers, a base layer, a binding layer, and sometimes a backcoat layer. Polyester is identified as the most likely base for videotape, while acetate and PVC may appear in earlier tape stocks. The recorded signal depends on the stability of those materials and on the continued ability of a playback machine to draw the tape across its path without causing further damage. That sounds technical. In a horror story, it becomes intimate. The tape has to be handled. It has to be taken from a shelf, inspected, inserted into a machine that may itself be old, pulled through a transport path, wrapped against heads, moved at a controlled speed, and returned to its shell. Every stage is contact. Every contact is an opportunity for the evidence to change. A digital file can be corrupted too, but the VHS cassette makes that corruption visible as an act of movement. The image is not simply opened. It is dragged back into the present. The National Archives also gives a broad estimate that matters here. Magnetic tapes stored under archival conditions generally have a lifespan of about 10 to 50 years before difficult-to-handle decay appears. That range is not a prophecy. It does not mean every cassette fails at a certain birthday, and it does not mean an old tape must be unreadable. But it does place many home recordings from the late 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s inside an age where playback problems are not surprising. This is where the fictional tape becomes more credible, not because it can predict the future, but because it can fail in ways that resemble intention. A damaged image does not look neutral to a frightened person. A dropout can become a blink. A streak can become a cut. A burst of noise can seem timed, especially when it interrupts a word that the viewer already expects to matter. The screen loses information, and the mind supplies continuity. If a news crawl is already moving along the bottom of the frame, damage can make it worse. The letters are there only briefly. They cross the screen at a fixed pace. If the tape wavers, if the image tears, if tracking drifts, a partial phrase may become the most alarming kind of phrase, one that almost resolves. The imagined viewer pauses the tape, rewinds, plays it again. The crawl passes a second time, but not exactly as before. Perhaps the machine catches the signal differently. Perhaps the tape edge is unstable. Perhaps the image bends just as the name begins. The viewer writes down what they think they saw, then watches again and sees another possibility. A surname could be a location. A location could be a surname. A warning could be a station promo cut off by damage. The more the viewer studies the tape, the less stable the evidence becomes. This is not because the tape is magical. It is because magnetic media can make evidence feel alive when it is merely deteriorating. Analog playback is a negotiation between a recorded surface and a machine. If that surface has aged, if the binder no longer behaves as it once did, if the tape has become difficult to handle, then the machine may not retrieve the signal cleanly. The result is not a simple blank. It is partial recovery. That partial recovery is the nightmare. A blank screen denies interpretation. A damaged screen demands it. The archive-report frame has to remain careful here. There is no factual source confirming a VHS cassette that showed tomorrow's news, and no verified case in the research record of a tape displaying a viewer's name in a crawl as a prediction. The documented facts support something quieter and more useful. Old videotape can become vulnerable, and vulnerable recordings can become ambiguous. In the gap between ambiguity and fear, a viewer can begin to treat malfunction as message. That gap is especially powerful because television news already speaks in fragments. A lower third compresses a person into a name and role. A crawl compresses an event into a line of urgent text. A weather alert compresses geography, danger, and time into a sequence meant to be understood quickly. When those forms are damaged, they do not become meaningless at once. They become half official, half broken. They retain the posture of authority even as their content begins to fall apart. Imagine the fictional cassette on a table under fluorescent archive light. Its label is ordinary. The handwriting is fading. The plastic shell gives no sign that it contains anything except a recorded broadcast. The first pass through the machine produces a local newscast. The second pass produces the same newscast with a moment of unstable image near the bottom of the frame. The third pass is when someone thinks they see a name. Not a full sentence. Not an explanation. Just enough letters in the crawl to make the room change. At that point, the tape has done something more effective than certainty. It has created a dispute. One person says, the crawl read like a warning. Another says it was tracking noise across text that already existed. A third says the recording should be copied immediately before another pass damages it further. The evidence is decaying while the interpretation is forming. Every replay meant to clarify the message may also make the object less trustworthy. That is the cruel elegance of this kind of horror. The investigator has to look again, and looking again may be part of the loss. Magnetic tape also brings time into the room in more than one direction. The recording itself belongs to a previous broadcast. The cassette's physical decay belongs to the years after that broadcast. The viewer's fear belongs to the present moment of playback. When the story claims that the tape shows tomorrow, it is stacking an impossible future on top of a very real past and a fragile present. The mechanics do not prove the supernatural event. They make the viewer stay with the object long enough to feel the possibility. A clean digital fake might be dismissed as fabrication. An old tape with unstable playback has a different authority. It looks unplanned. It looks recovered. It looks as if the strange part had to survive dust, storage, neglect, and a reluctant machine in order to reach the screen. That survival can feel like intention, even when every documented fact points first to material weakness. The archive's duty is to resist that feeling without pretending it is not powerful. We can say the tape is old. We can say magnetic media may become difficult to handle over time. We can say Dropout Distortion, tracking errors, and unstable playback can turn ordinary recorded television into uncertain evidence. We can say the viewer may be misreading damage. We can also understand why, in the dark, with the sound low and the crawl moving too calmly across the bottom of the screen, misreading does not feel like an error. It feels like being selected. And selection is the next turn in the nightmare. A damaged picture is frightening because it might hide a message. But an official-looking message is frightening because it does not hide at all. It presents itself in a controlled form with the cold patience of a system built to interrupt ordinary programming. The tape may be decaying. The image may be unstable. The viewer may be completing broken letters in their own mind. But once the crawl appears to follow the rules of a real warning, doubt changes shape. The terror no longer comes only from whether the message can be read. It comes from how calmly the message seems to know where to appear. If the damaged tape makes the viewer uncertain, the official crawl does something colder. It removes the comfort of uncertainty. It does not ask to be interpreted as a ghost. It arrives as procedure. That is why the crawl matters in this archive. Not because emergency text on television is an invention of horror, and not because a line of words moving across the bottom of a screen is, by itself, unnatural. It matters because real warning systems are designed to interrupt. They are designed to override the ordinary flow of programming and replace it with a more important message. The movie continues. The anchor keeps speaking. The sitcom laugh track is still somewhere under the signal, but the screen has already told you what to respect. The crawl is not decoration. It is authority moving horizontally. The emergency alert system is not folklore. It is a formal public warning framework in the United States, governed by Federal Communications Commission rules in Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 11. It exists to carry urgent information through broadcast and cable systems. It belongs to the same ordinary world as local stations, station identification, weather warnings, scheduled tests, and the uneasy moment when a program is interrupted by tones and text that do not care what you are watching. For the nightmare of the VHS tape, this is important. A fictional tape that simply shows impossible news can be dismissed as prophecy, hallucination, or a trick of editing. But a tape that seems to imitate an emergency alert enters a different emotional space. It borrows the structure of a system people have been trained to treat seriously. It does not need to shout. It only needs to behave as if it has permission. Under the Emergency Alert System Protocol described in the research record, an EAS message has 4 parts. The first is the preamble and EAS header codes. The second is the audio attention signal. The third is the message itself. The fourth is the preamble, followed by end of message codes. That list sounds dry because it is supposed to. It is a machine-readable order for public warning. It says that an alert is not merely a voice saying something urgent. It is a sequence. It has a beginning that equipment can recognize. It has a way to draw human attention. It has content. It has an ending. In ordinary use, that order is reassuring. It makes the alert identifiable. It gives broadcasters and equipment a shared language. It helps distinguish warning from noise. In horror, the same order becomes a cage. The first part, the preamble and EAS header codes, is not written for the frightened viewer sitting on a couch in the dark. It is written for the system. It tells participating equipment what kind of alert is being carried and how to handle it. This matters because the fictional tape does not have to look alive in order to become frightening. It only has to seem procedural. The fear begins when the viewer senses that the message is not improvising. It is following a route. A home recording on VHS complicates that feeling. The cassette is supposed to be passive. It was recorded from a broadcast at some earlier moment. Its contents should be fixed, degraded only by the familiar weaknesses of magnetic tape, dropout, unstable tracking, color noise, damaged sound. If a crawl appears on that recording, the first ordinary explanation is that the original broadcast carried a crawl. The tape caught it, like it caught the commercial break, the station logo, and the end of a local segment. There is nothing supernatural in that. But the premise of this episode turns on the moment when the crawl seems too exact. It does not only name a county or describe a storm. It appears to narrow its attention beyond the normal public function of a warning. It seems to address one household, then one room, then one person. Real emergency alert systems are designed to communicate to affected audiences, not to deliver private messages. The documented rules and mechanisms support urgent public information. They do not support the claim that a broadcast system can predict tomorrow or identify a lone viewer from a tape in a private living room. That distinction has to remain clear. The archive has no verified source for a VHS cassette showing tomorrow's news or inserting a viewer's name into an alert crawl. And still, the fear works because the form is real. The second part of the EAS structure is the audio attention signal. Even without going into the precise sound mechanics yet, the purpose is plain. It interrupts the body before the message reaches the mind. A viewer may look away from the screen. A radio listener may be washing dishes. A television may be playing quietly in another room. The attention signal is the system's way of saying, stop treating this as background. On a degraded VHS recording, that function becomes unstable. The sound may be muffled by age. The tape may warble. The speakers may flatten the signal until it becomes less like an official alert and more like a memory of one. But the listener still recognizes the category. The room changes. Conversation pauses. The old television, which a moment ago was only replaying yesterday's broadcast, now seems to be participating in an emergency that has not fully explained itself. The third part is the message. Under the rules noted in the research record, an EAS message may be audio, video, or text. That range matters for analog horror because it means the warning can occupy more than one channel of perception. It can be heard. It can be read. It can be shown. A crawl at the bottom of the screen is not an accidental horror device. It is one of the familiar ways official information can be delivered to television viewers. The message is also where the calm becomes dangerous. In ordinary programming, language can be emotional, persuasive, casual, or theatrical. News anchors vary their delivery. Advertisements plead. Characters scream. But warning language tends toward compression. It is shaped by usefulness. What happened? Where? For whom? Until when? What action should be taken? The power of that style is that it leaves little room for personality. So when a fictional crawl uses that calm against the viewer, it does not need elaborate supernatural language. It does not need to say the house is cursed. It does not need to say the dead are returning. The more frightening version is almost administrative. It states a condition. It gives a location. It gives a valid time. It acts as though the viewer's fear is already covered by procedure. That is the weapon of calm. Not panic, but format. The fourth part of the EAS sequence is the preamble plus end of message codes. This ending is as important as the beginning. It tells the system the alert has concluded. It restores the possibility of regular programming. In normal use, that closure is part of the reassurance. The interruption had boundaries. It entered with a recognizable structure and left with one. On the haunted tape, closure becomes suspect. If the end of message codes appear, then the impossible alert has behaved correctly. It did not merely intrude, it completed the ritual of official communication. That may be worse than a broken warning, because a broken warning can be blamed on damage. A complete warning suggests intention. Imagine the viewer pausing the tape after the crawl has passed. The tape hiss continues. The screen holds a local news desk from years ago, maybe with the slight smear of aging magnetic media. Nothing moves except the faint instability of the image. If the alert ended properly, then the room has been given a terrible kind of order. Something began. Something demanded attention. Something delivered a message. Something ended. And the viewer is left with the part the protocol cannot answer. Why did it name me? That question is where the documented system and the fictional nightmare separate. The emergency alert system can carry public warnings. It can use structured codes and attention signals. It can present audio, video, or text. Television alerts can appear in forms viewers recognize as official. But no cited source turns that into private prophecy. No regulation converts a VHS recording into a device for knowing the future. The story remains a reconstruction built from real mechanisms, not a verified event. But analog nightmares often live in that narrow space between what a system can do and what a frightened viewer believes it has done. The crawl does not have to be supernatural in its materials. It only has to be precise in its performance. It uses the face of public safety. It borrows the discipline of federal protocol. It turns the old promise of warning into a private accusation. Earlier, the tape's decay made every flaw ambiguous. A missing line could be damage. A broken letter could be imagination. A jump in the image could be an ordinary tracking error. The EAS structure changes the terms. Once the alert appears to have a proper beginning, an attention phase, a message, and an ending, the viewer is no longer studying random failure. The viewer is studying an event. That is why the crawl is more frightening than static. Static is chaos. The crawl is organized. Static suggests loss. The crawl suggests delivery. Static lets the viewer hope that nothing was meant. The crawl insists that something was posted. And beneath that insistence is sound. Before the words can be trusted or doubted, before the message can be read as public warning or private threat, the system announces itself in audio. Not music. Not a human scream. A designed signal, built to be recognized by equipment and by people. The calm of the crawl has its own machinery underneath it, and the old tape, if it has captured that machinery, has captured more than text. It has captured the tones that tell the room to listen. The sound beneath the crawl is not there for atmosphere. It is there because the system was built to be heard before it was understood. On an old tape, that distinction matters. A voice can be misheard. A line of text can be broken by tracking noise. A crawl can smear into the edge of the picture and leave the viewer arguing with the machine over whether a letter was an R or an N. But an alert tone has a different authority. It does not sound like an anchor. It does not sound like a local station. It sounds like equipment addressing other equipment, with the human listener caught inside the exchange. Under the Federal Emergency Alert System rules, the attention signal is specified with unnerving simplicity. In 47 CFR, Section 11.31, the EAS attention signal uses two simultaneous tones, 853 Hz and 960 Hz. They are not melody. They are not speech. They are not intended to persuade. They occupy the room as a technical fact. This is where the fictional tape becomes more frightening by becoming more precise. If a damaged VHS recording only produced a vague whine, the viewer might blame the cassette. A stretched tape, a tired VCR, a weak playback head, a bad copy made from another bad copy. Those explanations remain available. They have to remain available. This archive does not need impossible science to create fear. It needs an ordinary machine doing something ordinary at the wrong time. But if the sound resembles the formal attention phase of an EAS message, the listener is no longer only hearing decay. They are hearing procedure. The two tones matter because they sit between public warning and private dread. 853 Hz and 960 Hz are not secrets. They are part of a documented alert protocol. They belong to a system designed to interrupt broadcast routines when information must take priority over programming. In that sense, their terror is not hidden. It is administrative. The sound says, "Stop what you are doing." The program is no longer the program. Another authority has entered. On a VHS tape, that entrance is delayed. That is the old contradiction of home recording. The alert was designed for immediacy, but the cassette preserves it for later. The living room hears urgency after the fact. A warning built for one moment is replayed in another. The tone insists on now, while the tape itself says then. And in the premise we are tracing, the problem is worse. The tape does not only replay a warning. It appears to play one that belongs to tomorrow. The mechanics underneath that effect are cold and specific. The EAS protocol is not merely a tone followed by a message. The earlier chapter traced the four-part structure, preamble and header codes, audio attention signal, message, and preamble plus end of message codes. Here, the machinery inside the first part deserves closer attention because it is the part that makes the later calm possible. The EAS header format specified in 47 CFR section 11.31 includes the sequence ZCZC-ORG-EEE-PSS-CCC plus TTT-JJJ-HHMM-LLLLLLL. Visually, it looks less like a sentence than a shipping label for urgency. It divides warning into fields: originator, event, location, duration, time, station identification. The exact meanings belong to the code structure, but the emotional effect is easy to understand. Before the human message arrives, the system has already reduced an emergency into components that machines can pass along. That reduction is what makes the alert feel official. Not because it explains everything, because it does not need to. It has a format. For horror, format is stronger than frenzy. A monster can appear anywhere. A formatted warning has to appear correctly. It must begin in a recognizable way. It must carry the proper fragments of identity. It must pass through a chain of devices that accept its shape. The old tape, sitting in the VCR, seems suddenly less like an object and more like a witness to a transaction. The federal rules also identify the digital method behind the header. The EAS protocol uses audio frequency shift keying at 520.83 bits per second with a 2083.3 Hz mark frequency and a 1562.5 Hz space frequency. The terms are technical, but the idea is direct. The signal shifts between two audio frequencies to represent data. It is information disguised as sound, or sound disciplined into information. That is the sound of machinery in this chapter. Not gears, not factory belts, not the clatter of a projector. It is a modem-like negotiation at the edge of hearing as meaning. A burst that is not meant to be beautiful. A coded preface that tells receiving equipment what kind of alert is arriving, where it applies, and how it should be handled. On a clean broadcast, the listener may experience that sequence only as an unpleasant interruption. On an old VHS recording, it becomes evidence. The tape has not merely captured a voice saying there is danger. It has captured the shape of a regulated warning. It has kept the header, the tones, the attention phase, the grammar of interruption. And if the message later contains a name, the name becomes harder to dismiss. Not because the real emergency alert system predicts people. It does not. The documented rules support urgent broadcast messages, audio, video, or text, but nothing in the research record verifies a tape that shows tomorrow's news or names its viewer in a crawl. That boundary has to stay visible. The fiction is fiction. The source-grounded terror comes from the fact that real systems already know how to sound inevitable. A casual voice can be doubted. A whisper can be imagined. But a header has fields. A tone has frequencies. A message has a beginning and an ending. This is why the old tape seems to change status when the alert audio begins. It stops behaving like a haunted object in the usual sense. It behaves like a recording of a process. In the room, the viewer may not know any of these specifications. They may not know the simultaneous tones by their frequencies. They may not know the header sequence. They may not know audio frequency shift keying, or mark or space or bits per second. But they know the posture of the sound. Anyone who has heard public warning audio understands, even before comprehension, that normal viewing has been suspended. That recognition is bodily. The shoulders tighten. Conversation stops. Someone reaches for the remote and then does not press anything because changing the channel feels briefly inappropriate. The sound does not ask for fear. It creates obedience first. Fear comes after when obedience has no clear object. On the fictional tape, the VCR adds its own layer of dread. The cassette turns. The capstan pulls. The heads scan the magnetic surface. The television receives a signal from a machine that should only be repeating what was placed on it years ago. Yet the alert tone is not gentle with time. It does not sound archival. It sounds current. The old recording has the voice of an active system. That is why the machinery becomes the horror engine. Not because it screams, but because it performs. The EAS sequence has the patience of design. The header data, the attention signal, the message, the ending codes, each part implies that something recognized the event and delivered it through the proper channel. If the viewer's name appears after that, the shock is not only personal, it is procedural. It feels as if a bureaucracy has made room for the impossible. The tape may still be damaged. The audio may warble. The tone may bend under the limits of magnetic decay and consumer playback. A weak cassette can make stable things seem sick. But the more the recording resembles a real alert, the more the viewer has to confront a narrower and colder question. Not whether the sound is frightening, whether the sound is structured. Structure is what carries the nightmare forward. A warning that has tones can also have codes. A message that has codes can also have a location. The alert does not only interrupt the room, it begins to describe the world outside it, dividing danger into event, place, and duration. Once the tape has taught the listener to hear machinery beneath the warning, the next terror is not that the system speaks. It is that the system may know where to send its voice. By the time the warning has a code, it has already stopped behaving like ordinary sound. It is no longer only a tone on a damaged cassette or a warble caught under the hiss of old tape. It has become an address. Not an address in the human sense, not a name spoken from the television, but an address in the language of public warning, what happened, where it applies, and how long the warning remains valid. That is the quiet importance of NOAA SAME weather radio's SAME technology. SAME stands for Specific Area Message Encoding. It is not a horror invention, and it is not a rumor attached to late-night broadcasts. It is a real warning technology used with NOAA weather radio. Its purpose is practical and public, to let warning information be encoded in a way that equipment can recognize. The system uses special digital codes containing the type of event, the geographic area affected, and the valid duration of the alert. Those three categories matter because they turn an interruption into something more precise than panic. Event. Place. Time. A severe weather warning is not only a voice saying danger is nearby. It is a machine-readable message describing the kind of danger, the area that should receive it, and the period during which the warning applies. In ordinary life, that is a mercy. It prevents every alarm from becoming universal. It helps warnings reach the people who need them. It allows a receiver to respond to a message based on where that message is meant to go. In the logic of this tape, the same precision becomes unbearable. A general warning is frightening because it tells everyone to pay attention. A targeted warning is frightening because it suggests someone or something has already narrowed the world down to your portion of it. The house, the county, the broadcast area, the room where the VCR is still running. The old cassette does not have to prove prophecy in order to feel intimate. It only has to borrow the shape of a system that already sorts danger by geography. NOAA describes same information as something that can be heard before the voice message. To a listener, it is not a smooth tone or a spoken announcement. It can be heard as 3 bursts of digital static before a 10-second, 1050 Hz warning alarm tone and the voice message. That sequence is important because it has a physical texture. It begins with sound that seems broken if you do not know what it is. Short bursts. Digital noise. A harsh little cluster of machine speech that the ear may file under interference. On a clean receiver, that sound has a job. On a degraded VHS tape, it has an atmosphere. The home viewer hears the burst and may first assume damage. That assumption is reasonable. This archive has already moved through the weakness of magnetic media, through the way older videotape can produce unstable images and uncertain audio. A burst of rough sound on a cassette does not immediately announce itself as meaning. It could be tracking trouble. It could be a bad recording. It could be ordinary broadcast noise trapped years ago and replayed out of context. But SAME makes that uncertainty more dangerous because real warning systems can sound, to an unprepared ear, like malfunction. The system's digital information is not designed primarily as music or speech. It is data. It is there so devices can interpret it. Human listeners may only hear the surface, static with intent. That is why the fictional tape does not need to invent a supernatural language. It only needs to place real machine language in the wrong emotional setting. A late-night room. A television glowing blue and gray. A cassette whose label no longer matches what it contains. The bursts arrive, and for a moment they can be dismissed. Then the alarm tone follows. The 1050 Hz warning alarm tone belongs to NOAA's description of the weather radio sequence. It is not the same detail as the emergency alert system attention signal already discussed, with its simultaneous 853 Hz and 960 Hz tones under federal rules. The distinction matters. Public warning systems have related purposes, but their technical signatures are not all identical. For an archive report, confusing them would flatten the evidence. For horror, distinguishing them makes the evidence feel worse. Because now, the tape does not merely contain a warning sound. It contains the trace of a particular warning pathway. A VHS recording of a television broadcast might capture emergency information as it passed through the living room. It might preserve tones, crawls, station audio, or the remains of an alert relayed through the broadcast environment. The cassette would not understand any of it. The VCR would not know whether the sound was weather data, Federal Alert Protocol, a local voice message, or ordinary programming. It would only record changing magnetic information onto tape. Later, when played back, the machine would return the signal to the room with no judgment about whether the warning had expired decades ago. That is one of the central uneasinesses of analog media. A warning can outlive the emergency. The valid duration can pass, the storm can end, the broadcast can be forgotten, and yet the tape can still raise the alarm every time it is played. It can still make the old television speak in the present tense. Same technology makes that problem sharper because valid duration is part of the encoded information. The alert is not only about where and what. It also includes how long. In ordinary operation, that is a boundary. It tells the system that the message belongs to a particular span of time. But on a tape, duration becomes ghostly. The alert may have had a valid window when it was transmitted. The cassette may replay it years later without changing a syllable. The original warning is expired, but the recording does not know how to expire. That creates a documentary kind of dread. Not the dread of magic, but the dread of context removed. The viewer does not need to believe the tape is alive at first. They only need to ask whether the sound matches a real warning structure. If there are digital bursts, if an alarm tone follows, if a voice message appears after that, then the recording begins to resemble a known sequence. Event, geographic area, duration. The more closely it resembles that sequence, the less comfortable it becomes to dismiss as random decay. And then comes the question of geography. A public warning system is built to avoid speaking to everyone when it only needs to speak to some. Same codes identify the applicable geographic area. That is the useful, source-grounded fact. It is also the hinge on which the nightmare turns. The fictional message that seems targeted does not have to begin with a name. It can begin with a place, a county, a region, a local station's weather area, a familiar boundary that the viewer recognizes not because it is personal, but because it is official. Personal fear often arrives through public language. A person may ignore a strange whisper, but they will look up when a calm system names the area where they live. That is the genius of the premise. It understands that bureaucracy can be more intimate than confession. A warning does not have to say, "I know you." It can say, in effect, "This applies here." And if here is the place where the viewer sits, the distance between public notice and private threat begins to collapse. This is why the phrase, "tomorrow's news," fits so naturally beside emergency coding. News explains what has happened. Warning explains what may happen soon. A recorded newscast that appears to contain future information is impossible according to the sources in this archive. No factual source verifies a VHS tape that predicted events or displayed a viewer's name in a crawl. But warning systems are designed to speak before the worst moment arrives. They exist in the narrow corridor between normal programming and unfolding danger. They are built to interrupt the present on behalf of the immediate future. So when an old tape seems to show tomorrow, the mind reaches for systems that already live near tomorrow. Weather alerts, emergency messages, valid durations, geographic targeting. These do not prove the impossible. They explain why the impossible finds a ready-made costume. The audible digital static bursts are especially effective in that costume because they are both crude and precise. They sound ugly, but they are organized. They sound like a mistake, but they carry information. In analog horror, that contradiction is powerful. The audience hears noise, then learns the noise may have meaning. The viewer on the tape hears interference, then realizes interference can be an envelope. And the 10-second 1050 Hz alarm tone lengthens the moment. 10 seconds is not long in ordinary time. In a dark room, with a tape playing something it should not contain, it is long enough for the body to change its mind about the situation. Long enough to stop blaming the tracking, long enough to recognize that the sound has a beginning, a purpose, and a place in a sequence. Long enough for the listener to understand that the static was not debris before the warning. It was part of the warning. After that, the voice message becomes almost secondary. The system has already announced that it is organized. It has already suggested that the alert belongs to an event, a location, and a duration. If the voice says something ordinary, the viewer may feel relief. If the voice is garbled, the viewer may lean closer. If the crawl below the picture begins to form readable words, the room becomes smaller. Because geography is not just a map. In a warning, geography is selection. That selection is what prepares the tape for the next stage of its terror. Once an alert can identify an area, the screen can translate that area into text. The official visual form has its own demands, its own calm requirements, its own way of making danger legible. Originator, event, location, valid time period. A crawl or block of text that must be readily readable and understandable. The old cassette has taught us to listen for machinery. Now it begins to show us why the words on the screen feel so official and why a single line moving across the bottom of the image can seem less like a message than a record being entered against the viewer. The old cassette has taught us to listen for machinery. Now the machinery becomes visible. Not visible in the way a transmitter is visible, or a control room, or a rack of equipment with labeled switches. Visible is language. A line at the bottom of the screen. A block of text covering part of the picture. Words that do not behave like dialogue, advertising, or ordinary news graphics. They arrive with a different posture. They are not trying to entertain. They are not trying to persuade. They are trying to satisfy a requirement. That is why the crawl feels official. Under the emergency alert system rules, a television visual message is not an aesthetic choice left entirely to the mood of a station or the style of a broadcast. Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 11.51, requires that television EAS visual messages contain specific information, the originator, the event, the location, and the valid time period of the alert. It also allows that visual message to appear as either a video crawl or block text. And it says the message must be readily readable and understandable. Those words are quiet, but they are doing much of the work in this nightmare. Readily readable and understandable, not poetic, not suggestive, not hidden in the frame like a clue. A warning on television is supposed to be legible under pressure. It must tell the viewer where the danger applies, what kind of danger is being announced, who is originating the alert, and how long the alert remains valid. The system is built around the idea that a person may have only a few seconds to understand what has changed in the world outside the room. On a clean broadcast, that requirement is practical. On an old VHS tape, it becomes uncanny. Because the home recording introduces damage, blur, tracking instability, softened edges, and the slight visual fatigue of magnetic media. The tape can make everything uncertain. A face becomes a smear. A station logo ghosts at the edge of the picture. A commercial bumper seems to flicker twice. The viewer can blame the cassette, the VCR, the television, the age of the recording. But a crawl designed to be readable resists that uncertainty. It is made to cut through distraction. It is made to survive the viewer's panic. That is the bureaucratic terror of it. The words are not frightening because they are ornate. They are frightening because they are plain. In the fictional tape at the center of this episode, the impossible detail is not that an alert crawl appears. That part is grounded in real broadcast practice. The impossible detail is that the crawl becomes personal. The alert begins to behave as if the public system has narrowed its audience from a county, a broadcast area, or a weather zone to one living room, and then to one viewer, and then to one name. No source verifies that such a tape exists. No factual record supports a VHS recording that showed tomorrow's news or displayed the viewer's name in an official crawl. That boundary matters. The documented system can issue alerts. It can structure warnings. It can display urgent text. It does not predict the future. It does not authenticate prophecy. It does not, in the verified record, identify one private person as the subject of tomorrow's disaster. But the reason the fiction works is that it borrows the real shape of authority. Originator, event, location, valid time period. Each category has a function, and each function removes one form of comfort. The originator tells the viewer that the message is not merely anonymous text. In an EAS context, the alert is presented as coming from an originating source within the public warning chain. The viewer may not know the details of that chain while sitting in front of the television, but the visual form implies it. This is not a rumor. This is not a hand-painted sign. This is not a neighbor calling from across the street. It has entered the broadcast as a formal message. In horror terms, that means the warning does not need to raise its voice. It has credentials. The event tells the viewer what kind of emergency is being described. In ordinary public warning, this is the difference between confusion and action. A person needs to know whether the alert concerns weather, civil danger, evacuation, or another emergency category. The event is the noun that gives panic a shape. Without it, the viewer only knows that something has interrupted the program. With it, the viewer knows what the interruption claims has happened. The location narrows the field. We have already followed the logic of geography through NOAA Weather Radio SAME, where special digital codes can identify event type, geographic area, and valid duration. In visual television form, that machine-readable geography becomes human-readable text. A county name, a region, a service area, a place that can be recognized by the person watching. This is where a general broadcast begins to feel close. The screen is no longer speaking to everyone in the abstract. It is speaking to everyone inside the named boundary. And the valid time period gives the warning a clock. This may be the most disturbing requirement when moved into fiction. A valid time period does not simply say danger exists. It says the warning occupies a defined interval. It begins. It expires. It has an administrative lifespan. In ordinary use, this is necessary. People need to know whether an alert is current, whether a warning remains active, whether conditions may have changed. But on the fictional cassette, the valid time period becomes the place where tomorrow enters the room. A VHS tape is supposed to carry the past. Even when it records a live broadcast, playback turns that broadcast into yesterday's evidence. The viewer presses play and accepts the simple arrangement. This already happened. But if the crawl contains a valid time period that has not yet arrived, the tape violates the nature of its own medium. The words do not merely predict. They do so in the grammar of administration. That is colder than a whisper. A whisper can be dismissed as imagination. A face in the static can be dismissed as pattern recognition. A garbled phrase can be argued over. But an official-looking crawl with an originator, event, location, and valid time period gives the impossible the appearance of paperwork. It does not plead to be believed. It formats itself as if belief is irrelevant. The requirement that the visual message be readily readable and understandable also changes the viewer's role. In many ghost stories, the horror hides. The witness must discover it. Here, the horror is obliged to disclose itself. The system is designed to make the viewer understand the alert. The more clearly it succeeds, the less room remains for denial. That is why block text can be as frightening as a crawl. A crawl has motion. It passes from one side of the frame to the other, carrying a sense of continuation, as if the sentence began before the viewer noticed and may continue after the viewer looks away. Block text is different. It stops the screen. It occupies a defined area. It says, "Read this now." Both forms are recognized by the rules. Both can serve the same official purpose. One moves like a record being entered. The other stands like a notice posted on a door. In either form, the visual alert changes the meaning of the old recording. The tape is no longer merely preserving a broadcast. It is preserving compliance. It has captured not just a frightening message, but a message shaped by public warning requirements. That shape is what makes the fictional personalized crawl so unsettling. The viewer is not only afraid of the content. The viewer is afraid that the content has been processed correctly. Imagine the tape playing a late local newscast. The picture is soft. The colors lean slightly wrong. The audio bed carries a faint hiss. Then the alert appears. The text gives an originator. It names an event. It names a location close enough to remove abstraction. It gives a valid time period. Each part lands with the calm weight of a form field filled in by someone who knew exactly where to type. Then, where a county or area should be enough, the crawl adds the name. That is the point where the real system ends and the fictional nightmare begins. The official rules explain why the crawl feels believable. They do not make the impossible true. A public alert system is built for public warning, not private accusation. But horror often begins where a familiar structure behaves with one detail too much. The form is correct. The tone is correct. The readability is correct. Only the target is wrong. And because the message is readily understandable, the viewer cannot pretend it has been misunderstood. There is a deep unease in any warning system that must be both mechanical and human. It has to travel through codes and equipment, then arrive as language a frightened person can act upon. It has to be standardized enough for broadcasters and devices, but plain enough for the public. The emergency alert system visual requirements sit exactly at that crossing point. They are where machinery becomes a sentence. On the old tape, that sentence has been trapped. This is why the archive-report frame must keep returning to documented rules. Without them, the crawl is only a horror image, white letters, black bar, ominous movement. With them, it becomes something more specific. It becomes a visual artifact that resembles a regulated warning. Its fear comes from legibility, from required categories, from the absence of flourish. It is terrifying because it looks as though someone followed the proper procedure for announcing the wrong reality. And once we accept that broadcasts can be interrupted by formal systems, another question waits nearby. What if the interruption is not authorized at all? The crawl may feel official because it borrows the language of official warning. The tape may feel evidentiary because VHS was built to preserve what appeared on the screen. But broadcast history contains another, harder fact. Television signals have, at least once in a verified and public case, been seized by someone whose identity remains unknown. Not a prophecy. Not a personalized message from tomorrow. A real interruption in a real city on a real night. The visual grammar of authority explains why the crawl frightens us. The record of intrusion explains why the screen itself cannot always be trusted. On November 22, 1987, in Chicago, the boundary between ordinary broadcast and unauthorized presence did not hold. The boundary did not fail everywhere at once. That is part of what makes the Chicago Interruption so useful to the archive and so difficult to put away. It was not a citywide collapse of television. It was not a declared emergency. It was not the kind of official interruption we have been tracing through warning protocols, tones, headers, and readable crawls. It was smaller than that and stranger, a signal taken over long enough for viewers to understand that something had entered the broadcast from outside the program. On November 22, 1987, Chicago television viewers saw one of the most famous unresolved intrusions in American broadcast history. The figure that appeared was not a government speaker, not a news anchor, not a technician explaining a fault. It was someone wearing a Max Headroom mask or presenting the likeness of that character, moving in front of a shifting background. The intrusion has been remembered because it looked absurd. It has endured because it was real. The first interruption that night affected WGN-TV during its 9 p.m. Ron James Sapatic Abrek WGN-TV during its 9 p.m. Ron James and Sapatic during its 9 p.m. Ron James and Sapatic during newscast. That detail matters. A newscast is already a ritual of authority. It is not fiction being carried into the home and not a late-night experiment on a fringe channel. It is the station speaking in its public voice, local information, studio lighting, anchors, a schedule that depends on trust. When a signal intrusion cuts into that kind of broadcast, the violation is not only technical, it enters the viewer's sense of who is allowed to speak from the screen. WGN-TV was able to circumvent the intrusion after about 30 seconds. In ordinary time, 30 seconds is short. In broadcast time, it is enormous. It is long enough for a household to look up from dinner or a newspaper. Long enough for someone to ask whether the set is broken. Long enough for a home VCR, if it happened to be recording, to preserve the wrongness as evidence. The length also tells us something about control. WGN's response did not erase the fact of the interruption, but it restored the station's authority quickly enough that the event might have remained an alarming technical incident, a brief wound in the surface of the evening news. But it did not end there. Later that same evening, WTTW in Chicago was hijacked during a rerun of Doctor Who, specifically the serial Horror at Fang Rock. This second intrusion is the one most commonly associated with the Max Headroom incident, partly because it lasted longer and partly because of where it occurred. Doctor Who already carried viewers into a world of signals, monsters, strange transmissions, and impossible appearances. Horror at Fang Rock was fiction, but the interruption was not. It did not announce itself as part of the serial. It did not behave like a station promo or a planned break. It replaced the expected program with an unauthorized presence. This is where the archive-report frame becomes important. The fictional tape at the center of our episode, the tape that appears to show tomorrow's news and then a viewer's name in the crawl, has no verified source behind it. We are not pretending otherwise. There is no documented case in the record supplied here in which a VHS cassette predicted the future or personalized a news crawl to one watcher. But Chicago gives the fiction a factual pressure point. It proves something narrower and more troubling, that a television broadcast could be interrupted by someone outside the authorized chain and that the person responsible might never be publicly identified. The intrusion did not need to be prophetic to be frightening. It only needed to arrive where it did not belong. That is a crucial distinction. Official warning systems are frightening because they are structured. They contain originators, events, locations, valid time periods, tones, codes, and rules. They are designed so that a message can be recognized quickly as important. Signal intrusion frightens from the opposite direction. It does not reassure the viewer that the right system is speaking. It creates doubt about whether the system is still in charge at all. In the fictional nightmare, the crawl terrifies because it looks official but behaves impossibly. It names the viewer. It seems to know what has not happened yet. In the Chicago case, the terror is more grounded. The broadcast did not have to know anyone's name. It did not have to reveal the future. It only had to show that the path between station and viewer was not sealed. For a modern audience surrounded by digital platforms, passwords, streams, and software updates, it can be tempting to imagine old broadcast television as simple and one-directional. A station sends, a receiver receives, and the home set obeys. But the Max Headroom incident reminds us that the path was still a system, and systems can be attacked. The archive does not require us to invent a supernatural mechanism. It asks us to sit with the documented fact that, for a short time in Chicago, an unauthorized signal displaced legitimate programming on 2 stations in one evening. The unresolved nature of the case is not an embellishment. WTTW reported that the Federal Communications Commission investigated the 1987 Max Headroom incident but did not determine who was responsible. That sentence has the shape of an official ending, but not the comfort of one. Investigated, but not solved. Documented, but not explained. The broadcast returned. The archive remained open. That is why the event keeps its power. Many hoaxes lose force once the mechanism is known. A prank call becomes a name. A false alarm becomes a citation. A transmission error becomes a maintenance report. But the Max Headroom intrusion sits in a more uneasy category. It is verified enough to be real, but unresolved enough to remain unstable in memory. The screen was taken. The image appeared. The stations recovered. The responsible party was not publicly determined. For analog horror, this unresolved space is dangerous ground, and it has to be handled carefully. The purpose is not to inflate the record into something it was not. There is no need to claim that Chicago hit a prophecy or that the intruder was addressing one person across time. The verified facts are already strong enough. WGN-TV was interrupted during its 9 p.m. newscast. WGN was able to circumvent the intrusion after about 30 seconds. WTTW was later hijacked during Horror at Fang Rock. WTTW has described that interruption as lasting about 90 seconds before Doctor Who returned. The Federal Communications Commission investigated, and no responsible person was publicly determined. Those facts create their own atmosphere. They also change the way we look back at the haunted tape premise. Up to this point, the fear has been built from ordinary devices and official systems: home VCRs, magnetic tape, time shifting, public alerts, geographic codes, visual crawls. Each of those mechanisms adds plausibility to a fictional object that should not exist. The Chicago Interruption adds another layer. It suggests that even if the tape is merely recording what was broadcast, the broadcast itself may not be trustworthy. That is the pivot. A VHS cassette does not have to invent the message. It can preserve an intrusion. It can trap the exact moment when the station loses control. If the tape later looks impossible, the first question is not only what is wrong with the cassette. It is what entered the signal before the cassette ever touched it. This is the quieter horror of the Max Headroom case. Not the mask. Not only the strangeness of the performance, not even the fact that the image replaced scheduled programming. It is the chain of custody. The station sends a program. Somewhere before the home set, another presence interrupts. The viewer sees it. A recorder may capture it. Years later, the tape is found, labeled in ordinary handwriting, carrying a fragment that should belong to a normal night. And when investigators cannot attach a name to the interruption, the tape becomes harder to dismiss. It is no longer just a degraded object. It is a witness to a gap. By the time WTTW's Doctor Who broadcast returned, the incident had already moved beyond a technical inconvenience. It had become a case study in helplessness at the edge of control. A station can have staff, equipment, procedures, and a schedule, and still face a moment when the picture being delivered to viewers is not the picture it intends to send. That is where the next part of the archive narrows its focus, not on the masked figure as an icon, but on the room that was supposed to stop it, and on the 90 seconds when Master Control could not immediately take the signal back. The room that was supposed to stop it is easy to imagine incorrectly. Analog horror wants the control room to look like a command center in distress, people shouting over one another, warning lights blinking, a switch thrown too late, a wall of monitors showing the same impossible face. But the documented record asks for something colder than that. It asks us to stay with the practical helplessness of a broadcast facility that knew something was wrong and could not immediately make the wrong thing disappear. WTTW's own retrospective on the Max Headroom incident does not need embellishment to be unsettling. The station's account places the interruption during its broadcast of the Doctor Who serial Horror at Fang Rock on November 22, 1987. It reports that the unauthorized transmission lasted about 90 seconds. Then Doctor Who returned. That sequence sounds simple when written as a sentence. The program was interrupted. The intrusion lasted. The program resumed. But in broadcast terms, those 90 seconds are not empty. They are time occupied by failure. Not failure in the sense of negligence, and not failure in the sense of ignorance. The more disturbing point is that the station knew its output had been seized, and master control staff could not immediately stop it. This is where the archive becomes more frightening than the legend. The nightmare is not only that a strange image appears on the television. The nightmare is that the people responsible for the television are watching it happen too. WTTW's retrospective names station personnel in connection with that night, including air director Paul Rizzo and broadcast engineer Al Skierkiewicz. Those names matter because they keep the incident inside a working institution instead of letting it drift into folklore. This was not an abstract signal floating above Chicago. It was a scheduled public television broadcast with people on duty, with roles, equipment, and expectations. There was a program in progress. There was a facility responsible for keeping it on air. There were professionals who understood that the picture viewers were seeing was not the picture WTTW intended to send. And still, for about 90 seconds, the unauthorized signal remained. The figure on screen has taken up most of the cultural memory, the Max Headroom mask, the distorted movement, the sound that was difficult to understand, the absurdity of the performance. That is understandable. Viewers remember the image that entered the home. Home recordings, when they exist, preserve the invasion as spectacle. They make the intrusion repeatable. They turn the forbidden broadcast into something that can be paused, rewound, copied, uploaded, discussed, and rewatched long after the transmitter path has gone quiet. But if we keep looking only at the figure, we miss the more useful horror lesson. The real pressure point is not the mask. It is master control. A broadcast control room is designed around the assumption that there is a chain of command over what reaches the audience. Programs are routed. Sources are selected. Transitions happen on schedule. Interruptions, when authorized, are supposed to enter through known procedures. A viewer at home may not understand the path, but the viewer is meant to trust the result. The picture is supposed to represent the station's output. The WTTW incident exposed a gap between responsibility and control. The station remained responsible in the eyes of viewers. Its call letters, its schedule, its program were the context in which the intrusion appeared. Yet the picture had been displaced by someone outside that ordinary chain. For the duration of the event, the station's identity framed a message the station did not choose. That is why the helplessness matters. The incident was not only unauthorized content. It was unauthorized content wearing the credibility of the channel it interrupted. It appeared where Doctor Who was supposed to be. It arrived inside the continuity of a normal evening. It used the viewer's expectation of broadcast order against the viewer. And because it was transmitted over the air, it did not ask permission from the person watching. It simply arrived. The earlier WGN TV interruption that same evening had been brief. During the 9 p.m. newscast, WGN's signal was hijacked, and the station was able to circumvent the intrusion after about 30 seconds. That detail has already shown us one possible outcome: a station detects the problem and regains control quickly. WTTW's account gives us the more frightening version. The interruption lasted about 90 seconds, and the staff could not immediately stop it. The difference between 30 seconds and 90 seconds is not just duration. It is a change in what the mind can do with the event. 30 seconds may feel like a technical anomaly before it is over. 90 seconds becomes a scene. It gives the viewer time to recognize that the program is gone, to realize the replacement is not a mistake in the program itself, to wonder whether anyone at the station is aware, and then to understand that awareness may not be enough. The longer it remains, the more the home viewer's fear begins to align with the control room's limitation. This is also why the intrusion belongs so naturally inside the larger anatomy of analog nightmares. A VHS tape does not merely record what a viewer saw. It records the station's inability to prevent the viewer from seeing it. If a household VCR was running during that WTTW broadcast, the cassette would not preserve an explanation. It would preserve the 90 seconds themselves, the rupture, the delay, the return to Doctor Who. And that return is important. WTTW reported that after about 90 seconds, Doctor Who came back. The ordinary program resumed, and with it, the shape of regular broadcasting. To a viewer watching live, the return might have felt like relief. The schedule reasserted itself. The familiar fiction took back the screen from the unauthorized one. The station, in the simplest visible sense, had recovered. But the recovery did not erase the condition revealed by the interruption. It proved only that control could be lost and then regained. It did not prove that control had never been vulnerable. It did not identify who had entered the signal path. WTTW reported that the Federal Communications Commission investigated the incident but did not determine who was responsible. That unresolved fact leaves the event in a peculiar state, documented, public, technically real, and still anonymous. For an archive report horror story, anonymity is not a decoration. It is the open door. A named perpetrator can shrink an event. Once a person is identified, the case can become motive, method, punishment, biography. But the max headroom intrusion remains attached to a different kind of record. It is known by its effects, its timing, its stations, its footage, its investigation, and its failure to resolve publicly into a confirmed identity. The event is not unsupported rumor. It is documented. Yet the central human answer is absent. That absence makes master control feel exposed even decades later. We do not have to invent a secret operator standing behind the staff. We do not have to imagine that Paul Rizzo or Al Skierkiewicz saw something supernatural on a monitor. The source-grounded detail is enough. Personnel were working within a station that had procedures and equipment, and the station's master control staff could not immediately stop the intrusion. The horror is not that the professionals were incompetent. The horror is that competence did not instantly matter. In the fictional premise of a VHS tape that shows tomorrow's news, then places a viewer's name in the crawl, this is the piece that keeps the fantasy close to the documented world. Not prediction, not prophecy. The grounded element is loss of custody. A signal that seems official may not be official. A program that appears under a station's name may not be under that station's control. A tape found years later may look like evidence of what a broadcaster meant to say, when it is really evidence of what the broadcaster failed to stop. That distinction becomes sharper when we return to the idea of warnings. A legitimate warning system depends on trust. It depends on the viewer believing that an interruption has entered through authorized channels for an actual emergency or a test or another permitted use. A false interruption attacks that trust from the opposite direction. It does not merely show something strange. It borrows the habits of credibility built by ordinary broadcasting. The Max Headroom incident did not use the emergency alert system structure we have been tracing. It was not an official alert crawl. It was not a documented warning message with originator, event, location, and valid time period. But it demonstrates the adjacent danger that makes false authority so potent. If a signal can be seized, even briefly, then the screen's calm surface cannot be treated as proof of legitimacy. This is the hinge between the control room and the law. Once the archive has shown that real broadcasts can be interrupted, the question changes. A convincing warning on a tape is no longer frightening only because of what it says. It is frightening because of what category it belongs to. Is it an authorized message? Is it a simulation? Is it evidence of intrusion? Is it a recording of a false alarm that should never have been transmitted? The WTTW control room gives us the human scale of that question. About 90 seconds is short when measured against a lifetime. It is long when measured against a live signal that will not obey. It is long enough for a station to understand that something unauthorized is going out under its presence. Long enough for viewers to become witnesses. Long enough for a home recorder to capture the event and carry it forward. Then Doctor Who returns. The tape keeps going. And somewhere beneath the resumed program, beneath the comfort of the schedule restoring itself, the archive has gained a new rule. The most dangerous message is not always the loudest one. Sometimes it is the one that appears inside a trusted system, lasts just long enough to be recorded and leaves the people in control to prove after the fact that it was never theirs. The tape keeps going, and that is where the question changes shape. A broadcast intrusion asks who got in. A false warning asks something more bureaucratic, and in some ways more frightening. What exactly was transmitted? Not what did it mean to the viewer, not what did it resemble, not how did it feel when the tones began, but whether the signal crossed into a category that federal rules already recognize as dangerous. That distinction matters for our fictional archive. A tape that shows tomorrow's news is impossible in the documented record. No factual source verifies such a cassette. No source verifies a viewer's name appearing in a crawl before the event it describes. But a tape that contains a convincing emergency alert belongs to a different kind of unease. It no longer sits only in the territory of prophecy. It touches a real legal boundary. Under Title 47 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Section 11.45, federal rules prohibit transmitting emergency alert system codes, attention signals, recordings, or simulations of them except in specific circumstances. Those circumstances include actual emergencies, authorized tests, and specified authorized uses. The rule is not written as folklore. It is not a warning about superstition or panic in the abstract. It is a practical protection around a public warning system because the machinery of emergency communication depends on trust. The emergency alert system is designed to interrupt ordinary attention. That is its function. It takes precedence over entertainment, routine programming, background noise, and the private rhythms of a room. Its codes and tones are not decoration. They are part of a protocol meant to tell broadcasters, equipment, and audiences that a message may require immediate action. Earlier in the archive, we traced that structure, header codes and attention signal, the message and end of message codes. We looked at the way television visual messages must carry the originator, the event, the location, and the valid time period of the alert. We noted that the message may appear as a crawl or block text, and that the text must be readily readable and understandable. Section 11.45 gives those details a sharper edge. If the grammar of the alert is powerful enough to move a population, then imitating that grammar is not neutral. It is not just a sound effect. It is not just a convincing prop. A recording or simulation can be treated as part of the same problem because a false alarm can borrow authority from the real system before anyone has time to examine the source. This is where the archive-report frame becomes useful. It allows us to separate three possibilities without pretending they are the same. The first possibility is evidence. A tape may preserve something that genuinely aired. This is the ordinary power of VHS, and the reason the format has haunted every chapter of this case. A home recorder does not need to understand the program. It does not need to know whether the station meant to send the image. It simply records what reaches it. If an emergency alert system message was transmitted during an actual emergency or an authorized test and a VCR was running, the tape becomes a domestic copy of a real broadcast event. That copy may later feel uncanny. Time passes. The cassette ages. The label fades. The viewer forgets why it was recorded. The program around the interruption may be mundane: a sitcom, a local newscast, a movie, a weather report, a rerun left running after midnight. Then the alert appears with its formal language intact. It names an originator. It names an event. It names a location. It gives a valid time period. What was routine at the moment of recording can become ominous when played outside its context. But that is still evidence of a transmission, not proof of prophecy. The tape has carried the past forward. That is what magnetic media does at its most ordinary and most unsettling. The second possibility is simulation. A fictional production can create the impression of an alert without being a real warning. This is where the law becomes especially relevant for anyone building horror from broadcast language. The public warning system has recognizable elements: attention signals, codes, crawls, static bursts, severe phrasing, official timing, and the calm insistence of text that does not negotiate with the viewer. Those elements are tempting for a horror story because they do not need to shout. They arrive already dressed in authority. But federal restrictions exist because a convincing simulation can create confusion outside the fiction. If a podcast, a video, a film, or a broadcast uses real emergency alert system tones or close simulations without an authorized context, the problem is not merely aesthetic. The issue is that a false or simulated alert may activate audience fear, equipment response, or public misunderstanding in ways the creator does not control. That means the archive must speak carefully. We can describe the rule. We can describe why the sound and structure are frightening. We can describe how a fictional tape might appear to contain such an alert. But the documented rule forces the story to ask whether the tape is presenting a lawful record, an unlawful imitation, or something else entirely. The third possibility is intrusion. This is the one that pulls us back to Chicago without needing to repeat the whole incident. On November 22, 1987, WGN-TV and WTTW were interrupted by an unauthorized signal. WGN-TV was able to circumvent the intrusion after about 30 seconds during its 9 p.m. drug detective show. Newscast. WTTW's interruption during the Doctor Who serial Horror at Fang Rock lasted about 90 seconds before the broadcast returned. WTTW later reported that Federal Communications Commission investigators did not determine who was responsible. The Max Headroom incident was not an emergency alert system event. It was not an official warning. It did not carry the formal purpose of a public alert. But it proves something essential for the fictional tape. A transmitted signal can be made to appear inside a trusted channel without belonging to that channel. Viewers may encounter it first as television, not as crime, prank, interference, or intrusion. Classification comes later. The first experience is simply that the screen has changed, and the institution behind the screen has not yet explained why. Now place that lesson beside section 11.45. If a fictional VHS tape contains what appears to be a convincing emergency alert, the question is not only whether the warning is true. The question is whether the alert is authorized at all. Was it an actual emergency? Was it an authorized test? Was it a permitted use within the rules? Was it a recording of one of those lawful transmissions? Or was it a simulation, placed there by someone who understood the codes of public trust well enough to counterfeit them? And if it was neither authorized nor simulated for ordinary production, then the darkest possibility remains. It may be an intrusion preserved by accident. That possibility does not make the prophecy real. It makes the object more troublesome. A hoax can still be evidence. A false alarm can still be a real transmission. An unlawful signal can still be recorded faithfully by a machine that has no duty to distinguish truth from violation. VHS is indifferent in that way. It does not certify. It receives. It does not promise that the message is official. It only preserves the fact that, at a certain moment, something passed through the television and entered the tape. This is why the personalized crawl is so effective as horror. If the text at the bottom of the screen names a county, we understand it as emergency information. If it names a city, we understand it as geographic targeting. If it names a street, the frame tightens. If it names the viewer, the public system has become impossibly private. But the rules make that impossibility feel less like fantasy and more like a violation. Official alerts are supposed to describe originator, event, location, and time. They are supposed to be readable and understandable. They are supposed to be used within defined circumstances. A crawl that says your name is not merely strange because television should not know you. It is strange because it borrows a format built for public safety and turns that format into a private accusation. The screen remains calm. That is the worst part. It does not need a monster in the frame. It does not need the voice to break. It can use the slow, administrative pressure of a system designed to be believed. The horror is in the mismatch between form and content. The form says public warning. The content says you. For an archive, section 11.45 is a boundary marker. It tells us that these signals are not ordinary cinematic material. They are regulated because they belong to a chain of emergency communication. They carry civic weight. They can interrupt. They can command attention. They can frighten people into action. And because of that, a convincing false alert is not just another eerie image on an old cassette. It is a question of source, authorization, and control. So the fictional tape becomes harder to dismiss, but not because it proves tomorrow can leak into yesterday. It becomes harder to dismiss because every grounded explanation has consequences. If the alert was real, why does no record match it? If it was a simulation, who made it, and why did it imitate a protected warning format so closely? If it was an intrusion, how did it enter the signal path, and why was it preserved only here, on one aging home recording? The archive has no verified case in which a VHS tape showed tomorrow's news. It has no documented incident in which an emergency crawl lawfully addressed a private viewer by name as a forecast of death or disappearance. What it does have is a set of real mechanisms: domestic recording, official alert language, federal limits on false signals, and a proven history that broadcast channels can be interrupted by unauthorized presence. Those parts do not create the impossible event. They create the room around it. And in that room, the tape is no longer just a haunted object. It is a chain of custody problem. It is a compliance problem. It is a signal problem. It is a question of whether the cassette captured evidence, reproduced a forbidden simulation, or preserved the brief moment when something entered the public warning grammar and used it for a message no public system was built to send. By this point in the archive, the useful question is no longer whether the tape can be proven. It cannot. There is no verified case in the record before us of a VHS cassette showing tomorrow's news. There is no documented broadcast crawl that lawfully named a private viewer as the subject of a future event. There is no source here that turns a living room recording into prophecy. But that absence does not weaken the nightmare. It clarifies how the nightmare has to be built. If the story is going to remain honest, it cannot pretend that the impossible event has been documented. It has to do something more careful. It has to place the impossible event inside verified machinery and then let the machinery do what it has always done: record, degrade, transmit, identify, warn, and fail at the edges of control. That is the shape of this archive report horror. The cassette is not frightening because VHS was mysterious. It is frightening because VHS was ordinary. Video Home System was a consumer format, developed by engineers at Victor Company of Japan Limited, including Shizuo Takano and Yuma Shiraishi. The first VHS model in this history, the JVC HR3300, belongs to the documented world of the JVC Yokohama plant, to its announcement on September 9, 1976, and to its first sale in Japan on October 31, 1976. Those dates matter here because they pull the haunted object out of myth. A VHS tape is not an occult artifact by origin. It is a product of engineering, manufacturing, distribution, household adoption, and habit. It entered homes because people wanted to preserve television outside the moment of broadcast. A program could air while the viewer slept, worked, or left the house. The machine could wait in the room and gather the signal in the viewer's absence. That is the first verified part of the nightmare: time shifting. In Sony Corp. of America v. Universal City Studios, Inc., the United States Supreme Court addressed home videotaping for non-commercial time shifting. The importance for this story is not just legal. It is cultural. Time shifting made the delayed broadcast normal. It made it ordinary for a private person to watch yesterday's television today. It made the living room into a small archive, one cassette at a time. The fictional tape only has to violate that familiar rule by one step. A machine built to hold yesterday appears to hold tomorrow. The second verified part is the medium itself. Magnetic videotape is not a perfect witness. National Archives guidance describes videotape as having a base layer, a binding layer, and sometimes a backcoat layer. Polyester is identified as the most likely base for videotape, while acetate and PVC may appear in earlier tape stocks. Under archival conditions, magnetic tapes are generally given a broad lifespan of about 10 to 50 years before difficult-to-handle decay appears. That range is not a supernatural claim. It is a preservation problem. But for the archive report frame, it changes the behavior of the evidence. A cassette recorded in the late 1970s, the 1980s, or the 1990s can now occupy an uncomfortable age. It may still play. It may also mistrack, shed, flicker, smear, drop portions of image, or become unstable enough that every viewing feels slightly different. The horror story should not mistake those failures for proof of a ghost. It should use them as pressure. A damaged tape makes certainty difficult. A dropout might be a physical flaw. A garbled line of text might be a misread crawl. A momentary warble in the audio might be magnetic deterioration, machine error, or the ordinary sound of old equipment struggling to recover a signal. Then the crawl appears. This is the third verified part, official warning language. The emergency alert system gives the fiction its grammar. Under the rules described in the record, an EAS message has a formal structure, preamble and header codes, an audio attention signal, the message, and preamble plus end of message codes. The header format specified under federal rules includes the sequence ZCZC-ORG-EEE-PSSCCC plus TTTT-JJJHHMM-LLLLL. The system uses audio frequency shift keying at 520.83 bits per second with a mark frequency of 2083.3 Hz and a space frequency of 1562.5 Hz. The attention signal uses simultaneous 853 Hz and 960 Hz tones. For production, the lesson is not to imitate those sounds. Federal rules also prohibit transmitting EAS codes, attention signals, recordings, or simulations, except for actual emergencies, authorized tests, or specified authorized uses. The point is not to reproduce the warning system. The point is to understand why it frightens us. It frightens us because it is designed to interrupt. A program may be moving normally. A station may be inside its schedule. A viewer may be in a private room, half attending to the screen. Then the alert grammar arrives with its own authority. It does not ask to be part of the program. It supersedes the program. On television, EAS visual messages must contain the originator, event, location, and valid time period of the alert. They may appear as a video crawl or as block text, and they must be readily readable and understandable. That requirement is practical, but in fiction it becomes intimate. The crawl has to be clear. It has to tell you what, where, and for how long. It has to reduce fear into administrative terms. Originator, event, location, valid time. A personalized nightmare does not need to invent a new visual language. It only needs to let that existing language become too specific. NOAA Weather Radio SAME technology adds another layer of documentary plausibility. SAME uses special digital codes containing the event type, geographic area, and valid duration of an alert. NOAA describes SAME information as audible in 3 bursts of digital static before a 10-second 1050 Hz warning alarm tone and the voice message. Again, this does not predict the future. It does not identify a person by destiny. It identifies alert categories, places, and time windows. But the existence of machine-readable geography gives the fiction a mechanism to lean against. It lets the audience understand how a warning can feel targeted without requiring magic at the level of the system. The system already knows how to narrow a message. The story only narrows it impossibly far. Then there is intrusion. The Max Headroom incident in Chicago remains the strongest verified reminder that a broadcast can carry something the broadcaster did not intend. On November 22, 1987, WGN-TV was interrupted during its 9 p.m. newscast, and the station was able to circumvent the intrusion after about 30 seconds. Later that evening, WTTW was hijacked during a rerun of the Doctor Who serial Horror at Fang Rock. WTTW reported that the interruption lasted about 90 seconds before Doctor Who returned. Its retrospective says master control staff could not immediately stop it, and it names station personnel including air director Paul Rizzo and broadcast engineer Al Skierkiewicz. The Federal Communications Commission investigated, but WTTW reported that it did not determine who was responsible. That case does not make prophecy real. It does not make every strange tape a document of intrusion. But it proves that the trusted path between station and viewer has not always been sealed. It proves that, at least once in a famous unresolved case, an unauthorized image entered a broadcast and became part of what home viewers saw and what some recordings could preserve. So the fictional reconstruction has its verified parts. A household recorder can capture television for later viewing. A cassette can age until its evidence is unstable. A warning system can interrupt programming with official structure. SAME can encode event, geography, and duration. Federal rules make false simulation serious rather than casual. And broadcast history contains an unresolved intrusion in which the intended program briefly lost control of the screen. None of those parts says that a tape showed tomorrow's news. Together, they explain why that invented tape feels close enough to trouble us. The archive-report form has to keep that boundary visible. It can say, here is what happened in the story. It can also say, here is what the sources actually support. Those two statements must not be allowed to blur into fraud. The horror works best when the narrator refuses the easy lie. No agency record confirms the prophetic cassette. No federal rule describes a warning meant for one named viewer. No preservation guide says magnetic tape can remember events before they happen. The impossible event remains impossible, but the room around it is real. A real VCR waits to record. A real tape decays. Real alert protocols impose a cold order on panic. Real codes divide danger by place and duration. Real laws recognize the danger of false warning signals. A real Chicago broadcast intrusion showed that a signal can be made to carry a message no station intended. That is how the nightmare is built, without pretending to be a case file. Not by fabricating sources. Not by forging certainty. Not by claiming the archive found proof of tomorrow. It is built by placing one impossible line of text inside systems that viewers already trust, remember, and have fear. A crawl is supposed to tell the public what is happening. A tape is supposed to tell the viewer what has happened. When the crawl and the tape disagree about time, the whole domestic archive becomes unstable. And when the words at the bottom of the screen stop sounding general, when the bureaucratic voice of originator, event, location, and valid time begins to move toward one household, one room, one person, the question changes one final time. Not could this have happened, but why does the screen seem to know exactly how to say it? And that is the last movement of the nightmare, not the tape itself, not the warped image, not even the crawl, but the moment when a public language turns private. A warning system is built to remove ambiguity. It tells you who is speaking, what has happened or may happen, where it applies, and how long the danger remains valid. That is why the emergency alert system is so powerful as a real structure, and why it becomes so unsettling inside fiction. Its purpose is clarity. Its authority comes from procedure. The preamble, the header codes, the attention signal, the message, and the end of message codes are not supernatural devices. They are a protocol. They exist so that stations, equipment, and audiences can recognize an urgent transmission as something more than ordinary programming. But horror often begins when a system behaves correctly in the wrong situation. A crawl at the bottom of a television screen is not supposed to feel intimate. Under federal rules, a television emergency alert system visual message must include the originator, the event, the location, and the valid time period. It may appear as a video crawl or as block text, and it must be readily readable and understandable. Those requirements are practical. They are meant to help people know whether a warning concerns them. They are meant to turn confusion into action. The fictional tape changes only one part of that arrangement. It makes the location too narrow. It makes the valid time too personal. It lets the official grammar remain intact, but moves its target from a county, a city, or a broadcast area to a single viewer sitting in a room. That is why the premise does not need to prove prophecy in order to disturb us. There is no verified source showing a VHS cassette that displayed tomorrow's news. There is no documented case in these records of a lawful broadcast crawl naming a private viewer as the subject of a future event. The archive does not give us that evidence. It gives us something more ordinary, and therefore more durable, a world in which machines already record television, warnings already arrive in coded forms, visual crawls already move across the screen with official urgency, and broadcast signals have, at least once in a confirmed and unresolved case, been interrupted by an unauthorized presence. The fiction feels close because its parts are close. A home VCR was never a mystical object. VHS, the video home system developed by engineers at Victor Company of Japan Limited, was a domestic recording format. It entered the living room as a practical machine. The HR 3300, announced by JVC in September of 1976 and first sold in Japan the following month, belonged to a history of engineering, manufacturing, and consumer adoption. It was built to capture what had already passed through the air. A program aired. A signal arrived. A cassette recorded it. The viewer watched later. That ordinary delay is the hinge. Time shifting made television less fixed. After Sony Corp. of America v. Universal City Studios, Inc., the legal and cultural idea of non-commercial home recording for later viewing became part of the American story of television. A viewer did not have to be present when the broadcast happened. The machine could be present instead. It could sit quietly beside the set, receiving the evening's news, the late movie, the weather warning, the station identification, the accidental interruption. It could remember on behalf of the household. And once television could be remembered privately, it could also be doubted privately. Anyone who has watched old tape knows the atmosphere of uncertainty it creates. Magnetic videotape is physical. The National Archives describes it in layers: a base layer, a binding layer, and sometimes a back coat layer. Polyester is the most likely base for videotape, though older tape stocks may differ. Under archival conditions, magnetic tapes may last broadly from about 10 to 50 years before decay makes them difficult to handle. That range matters because many home recordings from the late 1970s, the 1980s, and the 1990s now sit inside that zone of expected fragility. A bad image is not proof of a ghost. A wavering picture is not proof of a message from tomorrow. Dropout, distortion, unstable tracking, and damaged playback are all part of the real material history of tape. But that is exactly what makes the fictional object persuasive. The tape does not arrive as a perfect miracle. It arrives as something compromised. The evidence is noisy. The sound wavers. The screen rolls. The viewer leans closer, not because the message is clear, but because it is almost clear. Analog horror lives in that almost. The same is true of alert audio. The Emergency Alert System attention signal under 47 CFR Section 11.31 uses simultaneous 853 Hz and 960 Hz tones. The header format is mechanical and specific. The protocol uses audio frequency shift keying with its mark and space frequencies, its rate, its repeated structure. NOAA Weather Radio SAME technology adds another layer of machine readability, special digital codes containing the event type, geographic area, and valid duration of an alert. NOAA describes same information as 3 bursts of digital static before a 10-second, 1050 Hz warning alarm tone and the voice message. These are not invented occult sounds. They are public-warning mechanisms. Their purpose is to wake equipment and people into attention. But in fiction, that purpose becomes a doorway. The tones say, listen. The header says, classify. The crawl says, understand. The viewer obeys before the content has even arrived, because the form has already trained the body. When an official warning appears, you do not first ask whether it is poetic. You ask whether you are in danger. So when the crawl finally carries a name, the horror is not only that the system knows you, it is that the system has used the correct tone of voice. That is where the Chicago intrusions remain such an important factual shadow over this story. On November 22, 1987, WGN-TV in Chicago was interrupted during its 9 p.m. programming. Newscast. Later that same evening, WTTW was hijacked during the Doctor Who serial Horror at Fangrock. WTTW reported that the max headroom intrusion lasted about 90 seconds before the broadcast returned. The station's account says master control staff could not immediately stop it. The Federal Communications Commission investigated, but no publicly confirmed perpetrator was determined. That event did not predict the future. It did not name a viewer in a crawl. It does not prove the fictional tape. It proves something narrower, and that is enough. It proves that trusted broadcast space can be violated in ways that viewers may experience first as programming and only later as intrusion. It proves that a signal can arrive wearing the frame of television while belonging to someone outside the intended chain. It proves that the archive can preserve not only official broadcasts, but failures of control. And this is where the law against false alarms becomes more than a production warning. 47 CFR Section 11.45 prohibits transmitting emergency alert system codes, attention signals, recordings, or simulations except for actual emergencies, authorized tests, or specified authorized uses. That rule exists because the form itself has power. A false alert is not just a lie. It is a misuse of public trust. It borrows the machinery of response. The fictional cassette borrows the same machinery, but it adds a contradiction no regulation was written to solve. The VCR is a device of yesterday. It records after the signal has already occurred. Its authority, if it has any, comes from being late. The tape can only say, "This was on. This was captured. This passed through the machine." A warning is a device of now, pointed toward what may happen next. Its authority comes from urgency. It says, act before the danger arrives. Move before the time expires. Believe the message while it is still useful. Put those two functions together and the object becomes impossible in a very specific way. Not because old tape glows. Not because a cassette can scientifically see the future. The contradiction is quieter than that. A machine built to preserve yesterday is displaying a warning that behaves like tomorrow. That is the unresolved center of the episode. Not whether a verified tape predicted the future. The sources do not support that. Not whether an emergency system can legally or technically address a single living room viewer with a prophecy. The record does not show that. The real question is why the story needs so little invention before it begins to feel familiar. We already know the household archive. We know the blank cassette with handwriting on the label. We know the tracking lines. We know the news crawl moving steadily beneath a face that keeps speaking. We know the official tone that interrupts ordinary sound. We know the difference between a warning meant for everyone and a warning that seems, somehow, to have found us. The tape in this story should not exist, but the fear around it comes from things that do. A public system designed to warn. A private machine designed to remember. A magnetic medium designed well enough to survive, but not well enough to remain innocent. A broadcast history with at least one famous unresolved breach. A legal framework careful enough to say that even imitations of emergency signals can matter. And finally, a name in the crawl. Not shouted. Not dramatized. Just rendered in the calm language of information, traveling left across the bottom of the screen as if it belonged there. By then, the viewer has already learned the grammar. Originator. Event. Location. Valid time. The cassette turns. The picture trembles. The device does what it was made to do and records the past. But the warning does not behave like the past. It waits at the bottom of the frame, official and impossible, close enough to read. And when your name enters the crawl, the archive stops being a place where old broadcasts are kept. It becomes a place where one of them appears to have been waiting for you.